The Somnolent Tales of Hollowshire, a novel in which nothing happens, beautifully. The morning arrived, as mornings do, with neither fanfare nor apology. Eldridge P. Holloway became aware of it in increments, first as a pale suggestion behind his eyelids, then as a quiet insistence that he acknowledge its existence. He lay still, allowing consciousness to seep into him like cold water into dry earth. The ceiling above him was precisely as it had been when he'd closed his eyes the night before. The same hairline crack meandered from the northwest corner, branching occasionally but never committing to a proper fracture. Eldridge had often thought of mapping its progress, but the effort required to fetch pencil and paper had always dissuaded him. A bird called outside, or perhaps it was a hinge protesting somewhere in the village. Eldridge didn't turn his head to investigate. The distinction, he felt, was largely academic. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. The house often made such sounds when left to its own devices, like an old man remembering his youth. Eldridge sometimes wondered if the house was more alive than he was. Then he stopped wondering, because wondering required energy. The pillow beneath his head had grown warm. He considered turning it over to find the cooler side, but the act of lifting his head seemed suddenly Herculean. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, disturbing a single dust mote that had been drifting aimlessly above him. It spiraled away, its simple journey disrupted by his breath. Eldridge felt a pang of something that might have been guilt, had he cared to examine it. The light through the curtains shifted imperceptibly. A cloud must have passed before the sun. Or perhaps the sun had passed behind a cloud. Eldridge couldn't be certain, and the uncertainty pleased him in a vague, unexamined way. His bladder made its presence known. Not urgently, nothing in Eldridge's life was urgent, but with a quiet persistence that would eventually require attention. He closed his eyes, granting himself 5 more minutes. When he opened them again, 17 minutes had passed. Time, in Hollowshire, was a fluid concept, measured not in hours but in gradual changes of light and the occasional growl of one's stomach. With the resigned air of a man facing a mildly inconvenient truth, Eldridge pushed back the covers. The air in the room was the same temperature as his skin, rendering the act of rising neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It simply was. His slippers waited by the bed, their leather cracked with age but still serviceable. Eldridge inserted his feet slowly, giving each toe time to acclimate. The journey to the chamber pot, 3.5 paces, was undertaken with the solemn deliberation of a religious procession. The house creaked again as he moved. Eldridge paused, listening. The sound didn't repeat. He wasn't disappointed. Outside, the village of Hollowshire stirred in its sleep. A shutter banged somewhere down the lane, though there was no wind. In the bakery, Mr. Darrow yawned over his unneeded dough. At the edge of town, the river moved sluggishly, as if it too couldn't quite muster the energy for its own existence. Eldridge performed his morning ablutions with the same lack of enthusiasm he brought to all tasks. The water in the basin was neither warm nor cold. The soap lathered indifferently. The towel, when he raised it to his face, smelled faintly of nothing in particular. Breakfast was a slice of yesterday's bread, slightly hardened at the edges but still pliant at its core. Eldridge chewed methodically, his gaze fixed on the kitchen window where a fly batted itself against the glass with quiet desperation. He watched its progress, or lack thereof, as he ate, occasionally blinking but otherwise unmoved. The fly eventually stilled, either from exhaustion or some private revelation. Eldridge took this as his cue to rise. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound loud in the quiet kitchen. He paused, allowing the silence to settle back into place before moving again. The parlor welcomed him with its familiar embrace of dust and stillness. His armchair, its cushions molded to the precise contours of his indifference, waited by the window. Eldridge lowered himself into it with the care of a man sitting on eggs. Outside, nothing moved except a single leaf clinging stubbornly to the maple tree. Eldridge watched it without expectation. The leaf would fall when it fell, or perhaps it wouldn't. Both outcomes were equally acceptable. Somewhere in the house, the clock ticked. Eldridge counted the ticks until he lost count, then began again. The activity had no purpose, which made it perfect. The morning stretched before him, vast and empty as the sky. Eldridge sighed, a long, slow exhalation that seemed to come from the very depths of his being. It was going to be another beautiful, uneventful day. The morning stretched on in the way mornings do when no one is particularly invested in their passing. Eldridge observed, without truly observing, as the light through the parlor window shifted from pale gray to slightly less pale gray. The sun was making its daily attempt at enthusiasm, but Holosha's perpetual haze rendered the effort moot. A fly, perhaps the same one from the kitchen, perhaps its equally unremarkable cousin, buzzed near the ceiling. Eldridge followed its progress with half-lidded eyes. It flew in circles, though circles implied a geometric precision entirely absent from its meandering path. Up, then left, then diagonally downward for no apparent reason, then up again as if surprised by its own descent. The fly's entire existence seemed to be an afterthought, which Eldridge found vaguely comforting. The armchair creaked beneath him as he shifted slightly. The sound was familiar, a companionable noise that asked nothing in return. Eldridge let his head loll against the backrest, his gaze drifting to the ceiling where a spider had, at some indeterminate point in the past, begun constructing a web in the corner. The spider itself was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps it had abandoned the project mid-construction, or perhaps it was simply biding its time with the infinite patience of arachnids everywhere. Outside, a cart rolled by on the cobblestones. The wheels made a rhythmic thumping sound where they passed over a particularly uneven stone. Thump, pause, thump, pause. The sound grew slightly louder, then slightly quieter, then disappeared altogether. Eldridge couldn't remember if he'd actually seen the cart or merely imagined it based on the auditory evidence. The distinction seemed unimportant. His pipe lay on the side table, untouched since yesterday, or possibly the day before. Eldridge considered reaching for it, but the distance between his hand and the pipe seemed suddenly vast. He watched instead as a thin beam of sunlight, if one could call it sunlight, it was more of a lightish gray beam, illuminated the motes of dust dancing above the tobacco pouch. The dust moved without pattern or purpose, content in its irrelevance. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once. Just once. The sound hung in the air for a moment before dissolving into the general background hum of nothing in particular. Eldridge's eyelids grew heavy. The fly had settled on the windowsill, its wings twitching occasionally as if remembering it could fly but choosing not to. The spider's abandoned web trembled in a draft that didn't quite exist. Time passed. Or perhaps it simply lingered, like a guest who can't take a hint. Eldridge's breathing slowed. The pipe remained untouched. The light shifted again, though no one could say for certain in what direction. And so the day continued, moment by indistinguishable moment, each one as unremarkable as the last, all of them blending together into a pleasant, featureless haze of near existence. The morning stretched on in the way mornings do when no one is particularly invested in their passing, as Eldridge observed without truly observing the light through the parlor window shifting from pale gray to slightly less pale gray while the sun made its daily attempt at enthusiasm, though Holosha's perpetual haze rendered the effort moot as a fly, perhaps the same one from the kitchen, perhaps its equally unremarkable cousin, buzzed near the ceiling, which Eldridge followed with half-lidded eyes as it flew in circles. Those circles implied a geometric precision entirely absent from its meandering path, up then left then diagonally downward for no apparent reason, then up again as if surprised by its own descent, with the fly's entire existence seeming to be an afterthought, which Eldridge found vaguely comforting, while the armchair creaked beneath him as he shifted slightly, making a familiar companionable noise that asked nothing in return, allowing his head to loll against the backrest as his gaze drifted to the ceiling where a spider had at some indeterminate point in the past begun constructing a web in the corner, though the spider itself was nowhere nowhere to be seen, perhaps having abandoned the project mid-construction, or perhaps simply biding its time with the infinite patience of arachnids everywhere, while outside a cart rolled by on the cobblestones making a rhythmic thumping sound where the wheels passed over a particularly uneven stone. Thump, pause as the sound grew slightly louder, then slightly quieter, then disappeared altogether, leaving Eldridge unable to remember if he'd actually seen the cart or merely imagined it based on the auditory evidence, though the distinction seemed unimportant as his pipe lay on the side table untouched since yesterday, or possibly the day before, which he considered reaching for, but the distance between his hand and the pipe seemed suddenly vast, so he watched instead as a thin beam of sunlight, if one could call it sunlight, it was more of a lightish grey beam, illuminated the motes of dust dancing above the tobacco pouch, with the dust moving without pattern or purpose, content in its irrelevance, while somewhere in the village a dog barked once, just once, with the sound hanging in the air for a moment before dissolving into the general background hum of nothing in particular as Eldridge's eyelids grew heavy and the fly settled on the windowsill, its wings twitching occasionally as if remembering it could fly but choosing not to, while the spider's abandoned web trembled in a draft that didn't quite exist as time passed, or perhaps it simply lingered like a guest who can't take a hint, with Eldridge's breathing slowing and the pipe remaining untouched and the light shifting again, though no one could say for certain in what direction as the day continued, moment by indistinguishable moment, each one as unremarkable as the last, all blending together into a pleasant featureless haze of near existence where the fly would eventually die and the spider may or may not return and the pipe tobacco would dry out imperceptibly until at last there was nothing left to say or do or be except continue breathing in and out in the quiet rhythm of a life carefully emptied of event, like a cup held under a slow drip until even the possibility of fullness is forgotten in the comfort of its eternal emptiness. Eldridge became aware of his own breathing in that moment, not suddenly, but with the gradual creeping awareness of a shadow lengthening across a field in late afternoon, noticing how each inhalation caused his ribs to expand ever so slightly beneath his worn woolen vest, how the exhale fluttered the stray threads of his unkempt moustache in a way that would have been imperceptible to anyone but himself, had there been anyone to observe it, which there wasn't, and which was just as well, because the observation would have required an expenditure of energy that neither observer nor observed would have been able to justify. The air in the room tasted faintly of yesterday's tea and the lingering ghost of last week's mutton stew, with perhaps just a whisper of damp wool and pipe tobacco that had long since lost whatever aromatic qualities it might once have possessed, though to call this combination of scents unpleasant would have been to assign it a character it didn't possess. It simply was, like the taste of one's own mouth or the particular quality of silence in an empty house when one has lived alone long enough that even the echoes have grown tired of repeating themselves. Outside, the weather continued its steadfast refusal to declare itself, not quite raining but not raining either, the kind of atmospheric noncommittalism that made carrying an umbrella seem both overly optimistic and unnecessarily pessimistic at the same time, much like life itself in Hollowshire, where even the most decisive actions tended to peter out into vague gestures before achieving anything resembling resolution. Eldridge's left knee ached with the dull persistence of a poorly remembered regret, the sort of discomfort that had been present for so long it had become more companion than complaint, like the faint ticking of a clock in another room that one only notices when it stops, which this one didn't, because the clock in the hallway had stopped years ago and no one had bothered to wind it since, though its hand still pointed resolutely at 23 minutes past 4, a time that may or may not have held significance at some point but which now simply was what it was, much like everything else in Eldridge's world, from the slowly accumulating layer of dust on the mantelpiece to the single sock that had been lying behind the door for so long it had become less an article of clothing and more a geological feature, all of it existing in a state of perfect equilibrium where change was not so much impossible as simply too much trouble to contemplate. The grandfather clock in the corner of the parlor, its pendulum stilled by some forgotten moment of neglect, stood frozen in time, its ornate hands perpetually indicating 2:45, though whether this was morning or afternoon had ceased to matter years ago, when time had gently unraveled into an endless ribbon of sameness that stretched from one indistinguishable day to the next without so much as a wrinkle to mark the passage of hours that bled together like watercolors left out in the rain, while Eldridge's gaze drifted across the room, coming to rest upon a small water stain on the wallpaper that had over the years taken on the vague shape of a man on horseback, or possibly a teapot, depending on the angle and the quality of light, though today it resembled neither and simply existed as a damp Rorschach blot that invited no interpretation, as a draught from some unseen crack in the wainscoting caused the flame of the single oil lamp to flicker momentarily, casting elongated shadows that crawled up the walls like shy creatures before retreating back into the corners where the darkness pulled thickest, undisturbed by the weak afternoon light that strained through the lace curtains yellowed with age and the accumulated smoke of countless fires that had burned low in the grate over decades of winters, each one colder than the last, or perhaps it only seemed that way as Eldridge's bones grew less forgiving with each passing year. Not that he kept count anymore, having long since abandoned the pretense that calendars served any purpose beyond giving one false hope that tomorrow might somehow differ from today, which it never did except in the most trivial of ways, such as the particular pattern of mold growing on the bread, or which tile in the kitchen had worked itself loose this week, these being the closest things to events that Holloshire could muster, while outside the wind picked up just enough to rattle the loose pane in the upstairs window, the one Eldridge had been meaning to fix since the turn of the decade, or was it the one before? He could never quite remember, not that it mattered, as the familiar rhythmic tapping had become as much a part of the house's soundtrack as the creak of the third stair, or the way the bedroom door refused to stay closed unless propped with the old almanac whose pages had fused together from humidity long ago, rendering it useless for anything but this single purpose, which it performed with quiet dignity day after day, year after year, as reliable in its way as the sun's half-hearted attempts to penetrate the perpetual cloud cover that hung over the village like a damp woolen blanket, muffling sound and ambition in equal measure, while somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled, though whether it marked the hour or simply swung listlessly in the breeze was impossible to say, as the sound carried oddly in Holloshire, sometimes seeming to come from the east when the church was decidedly to the west, a peculiarity the villagers had long since stopped questioning, just as they no longer questioned why the miller's dog only barked on Tuesdays, or why the water in the public well took on a faint bluish hue every third Thursday, these being the sorts of mysteries that ceased to be mysterious when one realized they had no answers nor any need for them, much like life itself, which simply unfolded in all its mundane glory, one uneventful moment after another, until the accumulation of them became a life, though to call it living would perhaps be overstating the case for Eldridge, who existed in the way a rock exists, or a particularly old tree, not so much participating in the world as occupying space within it with a quiet persistence that went beyond stubbornness into something more like geological patience, as he sat unmoving in his chair while the shadows lengthened imperceptibly around him and the air grew thick with the golden hours, dust motes dancing their aimless ballet through shafts of light that seemed to solidify before his eyes, becoming almost tangible as if one could reach out and grasp them, though of course Eldridge did no such thing, content instead to watch them swirl and eddy in the currents of his own shallow breathing, until even this slight motion ceased to hold his attention, and his thoughts, like the rest of him, settled back into the comfortable numbness that passed for peace in Holloshire, where nothing ever happened, and that was precisely how everyone preferred it. The teacup on the side table had long since surrendered its warmth to the indifferent air of the parlor, its contents now a tepid parody of refreshment, with a faint skin forming across the surface like the delicate scum that gathers on undisturbed ponds in late summer, though Eldridge paid it no mind as his fingers absently traced the chipped rim where a hairline fracture ran from edge to base in a meandering path that mirrored the crack in the ceiling, and perhaps in some metaphysical way the cracks in everything, as the poet said, though Eldridge couldn't recall the poet's name nor the poem, only the vague impression that someone somewhere had once remarked upon the universal tendency of all things toward entropy, which seemed self-evident to anyone who had spent more than 5 minutes in Holloshire, where even the most determined efforts at maintenance eventually succumbed to the gentle persistence of decay, like the ivy that slowly unpicked the mortar between the bricks of the old schoolhouse, or the way the sign above the butcher's shop had gradually faded until the letters spelled nothing recognizable, just as Eldridge's own memories had softened at the edges, blending together in enter a pleasant blur where individual years could no longer be distinguished from one another, marked only by the occasional vivid but inexplicable recollection, like the particular way sunlight had fallen through the beech trees on an afternoon in his 20th year, or the smell of lavender soap that his aunt had used decades ago. Though why these moments persisted while more ostensibly important ones had vanished he couldn't say, nor did he particularly care to, as he shifted slightly in his chair, causing the leather to exhale a soft sigh of displaced air that carried with it the faintest whisper of camphor and old sweat, while outside a single leaf detached itself from the oak across the lane and began its leisurely descent, spiraling downward in lazy loops as if reluctant to reach the ground, taking fully 3 minutes to complete a journey that gravity might have accomplished in seconds had the leaf shown any sense of urgency, which of course it didn't, just as the clouds overhead moved with glacial indifference across the sky in formations that might have been cirrus or cumulus, or perhaps just the atmospheric equivalent of a shrug, while in the garden a snail traversed the length of a paving stone at a pace that made continental drift seem positively hasty, its antennae twitching occasionally as if sampling the air for some purpose known only to snails and perhaps not even to them, as Eldridge's eyelids grew heavy, not with sleep exactly but with the weight of existing in a world where even blinking seemed occasionally too strenuous an undertaking, and so he let them close just for a moment, which stretched into several, during which time absolutely nothing happened unless one counts the gradual settling of dust upon the shoulders of his jacket, or the almost imperceptible darkening of the water stain on the ceiling as it absorbed yet another day's worth of humidity, or the way shadows pulled in the corners of the room, deepening from grey to charcoal to near black as afternoon eased itself into evening, with all the fanfare of a door left slightly ajar through which time slipped quietly unnoticed and largely unwelcome, though no one would dream of complaining, least of all Eldridge, who had long since understood that resistance was not only futile but exhausting, and so he sat motionless as the light faded around him like a photograph left too long in the sun, until he became just another shadow among shadows in a house full of them where nothing changed except everything did so slowly that no living eye could perceive it, just as the sea wears away cliffs, not wave by wave but molecule by molecule over centuries, until one day what was solid becomes sand, and even that eventually ceases to be, which is after all the way of all things in Hollowshire and everywhere else, though in Hollowshire at least they had the decency not to rush it. The mantelpiece clock, its brass casing tarnished to the colour of forgotten pennies, gave a half-hearted tick that might have been the precursor to striking the hour, or simply the death rattle of its overwound mainspring, though Eldridge hadn't wound it since that wet Thursday last autumn, or possibly the autumn before, when the damp had seeped into everything, including one's sense of chronology, and as the sound dissipated into the thick air of the parlour like a sigh into a pillow, his attention drifted to the portrait above the fireplace, where his great-uncle Horace gazed sternly from behind a magnificent set of mutton chops that had probably required more daily maintenance than the entire village of Hollowshire put together, the oils having darkened over decades until the expression hovered ambiguously between disapproval and indigestion, the eyes following one about the room with that peculiar trick of portraiture that makes the observed feel oddly culpable, though for what exactly one could never be certain, much like the vague unease that accompanied finding an extra spoon after washing up, or noticing one's shadow had developed a slight limp, these being the sorts of metaphysical quandaries that occupied Eldridge's mind during the long stretches between breakfast and luncheon, or what passed for luncheon, being essentially breakfast reheated with perhaps a biscuit added if the tin hadn't yet achieved its usual state of emptiness, while outside the postman made his daily pilgrimage down the lane with the resigned air of a man delivering circulars to the damned, his leather satchel flapping against his thigh with the hollow sound of promises unkept, pausing at each gate just long enough to confirm the continued absence of anything worth delivering before moving on to the next, his footsteps crunching the gravel with the same measured cadence he'd maintained for the past 17 years, give or take, a rhythm so precise one could set one's pocket watch by it if one owned a pocket watch, and if it kept time better than the mantelpiece clock, which it undoubtedly would, though Eldridge had long since abandoned the pretense that knowing the hour served any purpose beyond giving shape to disappointment, preferring instead to mark time by more reliable metrics like the gradual softening of the cheese in the larder, or the progressive yellowing of the newspaper left unread on the side table, its headlines having achieved a sort of timeless irrelevance somewhere between the Franco-Prussian War and the invention of the electric toaster, the ink bleeding into the paper until the words became as indistinct as the memories they purported to record, much like Eldridge's own recollections, which these days seemed to consist mainly of weather patterns and minor digestive complaints, the great events of his life having receded like tides, leaving behind only the odd seashell of recollection. The particular way light fell through the station window on the day he almost caught the 3:15 to Paddington, or the smell of peppermints in his grandmother's purse, while the weightier moments had dissolved like sugar in tea, leaving neither trace nor aftertaste, which was perhaps for the best, as the past, when examined too closely, tended to crumble like old parchment, revealing nothing so much as the fragility of one's own narrative, a realization that settled upon Eldridge now with all the weight of a damp handkerchief as the last of the daylight bled from the room and the portrait's eyes disappeared into the gathering gloom, leaving him alone with the ticking that wasn't really ticking and the thoughts that weren't really thoughts and the life that wasn't really, but perhaps that was enough for one day, or one lifetime, in Hollowshire. The fire in the grate, if one could call the smouldering remains of yesterday's newspaper and 3 lumps of questionable coal a fire, emitted a listless puff of smoke that curled upward in a slow spiral before dissolving into the general atmosphere of the room, adding another barely perceptible layer to the patina of wood smoke and pipe tobacco that had been seasoning the wallpaper since Queen Victoria was a girl, while Eldridge's left slipper, having gradually inched away from its partner over the course of the afternoon, now sat at an angle that suggested either profound existential fatigue or simply the inevitable result of one's foot slowly rotating in repose, though the distinction mattered to no one, least of all the slipper itself, which had long since resigned itself to a life of quiet servitude, its once plush lining now worn smooth as a river stone by decades of unremarkable use, much like the doorknobs and banisters of the house whose brass fittings had acquired the soft sheen of human touch over generations until they seemed less like household objects and more like archaeological artifacts documenting the slow passage of ordinary hands through ordinary time, while outside the first tentative flakes of what might become snow or might simply be ash from the chimney next door drifted past the window in no particular hurry to reach the destination, their indecision mirroring that of the cat, or possibly a particularly ambitious hedgehog that had been sitting motionless by the garden gate for the past 40 minutes in what could either be interpreted as profound meditation or a minor neurological event, its inscrutable animal gaze fixed on some point just beyond human perception where all of life's mysteries presumably made perfect sense, though Eldridge couldn't be bothered to rise and investigate, preferring instead to watch the spectacle, if one could call it that, from the comfort of his chair where the only mystery that concerned him was whether he'd muster the energy to light his pipe before nightfall or simply let the evening pass in smokeless contemplation, a dilemma that occupied his mind with just enough intensity to stave off more pressing questions like why the cupboard door never stayed closed, or what had become of that letter from his solicitor, or was it his barber that had arrived sometime last spring and which he'd set aside for later consideration, the envelope still sitting unopened on the hall table beneath the thin layer of dust that had accumulated with such imperceptible slowness that its growth could only be measured by comparing its current state to memories of its former self, much like the gradual shift in one's hairline or the creeping realization that one's knees now made sounds previously associated with poorly maintained farm equipment, these being the sorts of observations that passed for profound insight in Hollowshire, where the great philosophical questions tended to revolve around whether rain would stop in time for it to not matter, or if the butcher's claim of fresh rabbit could withstand even cursory scrutiny, the answers being generally less important than the asking, which itself was mostly just something to do between breakfast and the first nap of the day, a period that currently stretched before Eldridge like an unrolled bolt of undyed linen, neutral, unassuming, and faintly promising in its blank potential, though likely to remain unused until eventually repurposed as a dust cover for some forgotten piece of furniture, much like most afternoons in Hollowshire and indeed most lives, if one were being perfectly honest, which no one ever was, at least not after luncheon. The grandfather clock in the corner emitted a sound that might have been a tick or perhaps just the settling of ancient wood in its joints, a noise so tentative it seemed apologetic for interrupting the silence at all. Eldridge's eyelids drooped like wet paper bags, the rhythm of his breathing sinking imperceptibly with the rise and fall of the threadbare curtains that stirred occasionally when the house remembered to exhale. On the windowsill, a fly that had been dead for 3 days lay perfectly preserved in the dry stillness, its wings still gleaming with the last vestiges of iridescence, as if death in Holosha was simply another form of inactivity. The teacup beside Eldridge's chair had developed a fine network of cracks in its glaze that mirrored the tributaries of the Thames, though no one would ever chart these particular waterways. Outside, the weather continued its ambivalent performance, not quite raining but making the sort of atmospheric adjustments that suggested rain might be considered at some indeterminate future date. A single hazelnut, overlooked by some long-departed squirrel, rested in the exact center of the garden path where it had lain through 2 winters and 1 surprisingly passionate spring, its shell growing softer by degrees while the world moved around it with glacial indifference. Eldridge's right sock had developed a hole exactly the size and shape of a farthing, though no farthing had touched that spot in living memory. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and the ghost of cinnamon from some Christmas past when the house had briefly remembered festivity before lapsing back into its customary state of quiet endurance. In the kitchen, a spoon rested in a jam jar where it had been left after some half-remembered breakfast, the metal slowly acquiring a patina that would outlast whoever had put it there. The whole scene existed in perfect equilibrium, not decaying so much as gently subsiding into its own essence, like a sigh becoming part of the atmosphere. Somewhere in the village, a door closed with the soft finality of a bookmark being placed between pages no one would ever reopen. And so the afternoon continued its measured surrender to evening, moment by indistinguishable moment, each one as unremarkable as the last, until even the light seemed to forget why it had bothered coming in at all. The grandfather clock's pendulum hung motionless, frozen in mid-swing as if time itself had grown weary of its ceaseless toing and froing. Eldridge's fingers rested upon the armchair's fraying upholstery, tracing patterns only he could discern in the fabric's faded floral motif, patterns that might have mapped the rise and fall of empires or simply marked the passage of meals long digested. A thin layer of dust coated every surface like a second skin, softening edges and blurring boundaries until the room appeared viewed through gauze. The fire had diminished to a single coal that glowed with the resigned persistence of a dying star, its heat insufficient to warm anything beyond its own immediate demise. Outside, the world moved with the lethargy of a sleepwalker. Clouds drifted across the sky not as discrete entities but as one continuous grey mass, their movement detectable only by the occasional darkening of the window panes. The village pump creaked on its rusted hinge, responding to some breeze too faint for human skin to register. In the lane, a scrap of paper that might once have been a shopping list or a love letter skittered halfway across the cobbles before losing momentum and subsiding into the gutter, where it would remain until the next half-hearted wind or the coming of rain, whichever happened first, though likely neither would arrive before the paper itself disintegrated into meaningless fibers. Eldridge's breathing had slowed to such an extent that an observer might have mistaken him for a particularly lifelike waxwork, the kind that accumulates dust in provincial museums, its provenance long forgotten. His teacup held the dregs of 15 separate infusions, the tannins having formed a patina that no amount of scrubbing could remove, not that scrubbing had been attempted in recent memory. The spoon resting against the saucer had tarnished to a shade that perfectly matched the grey afternoon light, its surface pitted with microscopic craters that told the story of every sugar cube it had ever stirred. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard released a groan it had been holding since morning. The sound traveled through empty rooms and up the staircase, growing fainter with each step until it expired completely in the attic, where trunks of abandoned ambitions gathered dust beside hatboxes containing dreams too fragile to wear. The air smelled of camphor and the faint, sweet rot of apples left too long in the bowl, a scent that permeated every corner of the house like a memory no one could quite place. As the last of the daylight retreated, the shadows in the room deepened and merged until chair legs became indistinguishable from their own dark twins. The coal in the grate surrendered its final glow, leaving only a whisper of warmth that dissipated before it could be properly mourned. Eldridge's eyelids closed with the slow finality of curtains drawing on a play nobody had attended. And so the house settled into its nightly repose, a sleep so deep it might have been mistaken for death, were it not for the occasional creak of timber and the soft, rhythmic sigh of a man whose dreams, if he had any at all, would be indistinguishable from his waking life. The night stretched ahead, vast and undisturbed, its silence broken only by the distant, uncertain hoot of an owl that may or may not have been there at all. The grandfather clock's hands remained frozen at 3:17, a time that had ceased to have any meaning years ago when the mechanism's last wheezing ticks had faded into the perpetual twilight of the parlor. Eldridge's half-closed eyes reflected the dying firelight like tarnished coins at the bottom of a wishing well, their surfaces clouded with the patina of countless unvoiced thoughts. His right slipper had slipped from his foot at some indeterminate hour, revealing a sock whose darned heel bore witness to repairs made by hands long since turned to dust in the churchyard. The air hung thick with the accumulated exhalations of decades, pipe smoke long absorbed into the curtains, the ghost of beef broth simmered during the reign of Edward VII, the faint metallic tang of rain that had seeped through the roof tiles during last autumn's storms and would likely do so again. A spider in the corner, the same one from Tuesday or possibly its great-great-grand offspring, tested the tensile strength of its web with the cautious deliberation of an engineer surveying a suspect bridge, each silken strand trembling with the weight of existential uncertainty. Outside, the world continued its slow unraveling at a pace that suited Holosha perfectly. A single leaf clung to the oak tree with the desperate tenacity of a spinster clutching her last good teacup, its stem fraying fiber by fiber in a process too gradual for human perception. The village well's bucket swayed on its rope, not because anyone had drawn water, but simply because some ancient memory of movement lingered in its weathered wood. Over at the smithy, though it hadn't seen a hot forge since the iron horse gave way to the internal combustion engine, a horseshoe hung above the door, its protective magic long since expired but remaining in place through sheer force of habit. Eldridge's pipe lay cold in the ashtray, its bowl packed with yesterday's tobacco and the day before's, the mixture having achieved a consistency somewhere between potting soil and archaeological sediment. The newspaper on the side table had progressed from yellow to a delicate ochre, its headlines announcing events whose participants had all taken their secrets to the grave. A watermark on the ceiling, the one that sometimes resembled Napoleon in profile during particularly damp winters, had expanded by perhaps a millimeter, its edges blurring into the plaster like memories of childhood summers. As evening deepened its claim on the day, the shadows in the corners of the room grew bold, creeping forward to claim territory abandoned by the retreating light. The temperature dropped by degrees so incremental they would have shamed a thermometer into silence. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a nightingale coughed experimentally before thinking better of it. And thus the world turned, as it always had and always would in Holosha, not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with the quiet satisfaction of a door left slightly ajar in case anyone should call, though no one ever did. The grandfather clock's motionless hands pointed eternally to 3:17, as they had since the day its corroded pendulum gave its last reluctant swing during the particularly uneventful summer of 1912. Eldridge's left eyebrow twitched in what might have been mistaken for profound thought, but was in fact merely a delayed reaction to a draft that had crept through the window sash some 20 minutes prior. His teacup bore the fossilized remains of what naturalists might classify as a new species of tea leaf mold, its concentric growth rings marking the passage of time with more accuracy than any clock in the parish. The fire had subsided to a single coal that glowed with the melancholic persistence of a jilted lover, its feeble warmth barely reaching Eldridge's slippered feet where the big toe protruded like a shy groundhog peering from its burrow. The sock in question had been darned so many times that its original fiber content was now a matter for scholarly debate, its various mends forming a topographic map of decades' worth of domestic ennui. Outside, the evening settled over Holosha with the quiet desperation of a second-rate pianist playing to an empty music hall. The village pump creaked on its rusted hinge, its complaint echoing down lanes where not so much as a stray cat stirred. In the churchyard, the weather-vane rooster pointed resolutely northeast, though no wind had troubled its bearings since the day the vicar's wife ran off with the encyclopedia salesman, an event still considered dangerously racy by local standards despite occurring during Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The air in the parlor had thickened to the consistency of vichyssoise left too long at room temperature, heavy with particles of dust that drifted in the dying light like the ghosts of long-dead motes. A portrait of Eldridge's great-aunt Prudence gazed down from above the mantel, her stern expression having softened over the years as the varnish yellowed, giving her the appearance of someone who had just smelled something unpleasant but was too well-bred to mention it. As the final coal surrendered to ash, the room's shadows merged into one continuous darkness that pulled around the furniture like black molasses. The house settled with a sigh that might have been mistaken for contentment in more sentimental company. Somewhere in the distance, a nightjar called once before reconsidering its life choices. And so the day concluded precisely as it had begun, with no particular purpose achieved, no memorable words spoken, and no discernible change in the universal order of things. Which was, when one really thought about it, though Eldridge made a point of not thinking about much at all, exactly as it should be. The grandfather clock's hands remained frozen at 3:17, their motionless state perfectly mirroring the torpor that had settled over the house like a thick woolen blanket. Eldridge's fingers twitched imperceptibly against the armrest, tracing the same groove they'd worn into the fabric over 37 years of quiet contemplation. The fire had long since collapsed into a small pyramid of grey ash, though the ghost of warmth still lingered in the hearth bricks, the kind of residual heat one only notices in its absence. A single dust mote drifted through a slant of fading light, executing a slow spiral descent that would take approximately 14 minutes to complete, not that anyone was timing. It was joined by a second mote, then a third, until a miniature constellation had formed in the stale air, performing an elaborate ballet for an audience of none. The teacup on the side table bore a crack that had propagated so gradually over the decades that it now resembled a detailed map of the Thames estuary, complete with tributaries. Outside, the evening performed its usual ablutions with monastic regularity. The oak tree's last remaining leaf, which had been clinging to its branch since Michaelmas with the tenacity of a bureaucrat to petty authority, finally detached itself and began a leisurely descent that would take a full 7 minutes to reach the ground. In the lane, a puddle that had never properly evaporated since the autumn rains reflected the sky with such apathy that even the clouds seemed disinclined to move across its surface. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and the ghost of cinnamon from some forgotten Christmas past, undercut with a top note of mildew that had been developing its character since the Diamond Jubilee. Eldridge's waistcoat button strained slightly against its thread, a silent testament to Mrs. Dobbin's short-lived attempt to improve his nutrition during her tenure as housekeeper in 1903. The wallpaper behind him had faded in alternating stripes where sunlight had touched it through the years, creating a pattern like the ghost of a zebra. As darkness finally completed its patient conquest of the room, the shadows blended together until it became impossible to distinguish between furniture and emptiness. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once before remembering it couldn't be bothered. The house exhaled softly through its floorboards, settling into the kind of silence that isn't so much broken as worn away gradually by the friction of time. And there, in that perfect equilibrium between being and not being, the universe held its breath for what might have been a moment or an eternity, though in Hollowshire, the distinction had ceased to matter around the same time the last interesting thing happened, whenever that was. The grandfather clock's hands remained frozen at 3:17, as they had since the afternoon in 1912 when time itself seemed to lose interest in Hollowshire. Eldridge's breathing had slowed to such an imperceptible rhythm that he might have been mistaken for a particularly lifelike waxwork, the kind that accumulates layers of dust in forgotten museum corners, its placard having yellowed into illegibility decades prior. His right slipper hung precariously from his toes at an angle that defied both gravity and common sense, yet somehow maintained its position through sheer force of apathy. The fire had reduced itself to a single glowing ember that pulsed weakly like the dying thoughts of a forgotten philosopher, its faint light casting shadows that moved with all the urgency of continental drift. A spider in the corner, descendant of generations of spiders who had all lived remarkably similar lives, adjusted its web by a fraction of a millimeter, an engineering project that would occupy the remainder of its days and possibly those of its offspring. Outside, the world continued its slow unraveling at a pace that wouldn't disturb so much as a blade of grass. The village weathervane had settled into a permanent state of indecision, its arrow pointing simultaneously northeast and southwest depending on whether one squinted. In the churchyard, lichen spread across headstones at a rate that would see names completely obscured by 2147, not that anyone was marking their calendar. The air in the parlor had achieved a perfect equilibrium of temperature where it was impossible to tell where body heat ended and room temperature began. A thin layer of dust coated every surface with democratic impartiality, softening edges and blurring boundaries until the room resembled an impressionist painting of itself. The portrait of Great Uncle Thaddeus above the mantel had darkened to the point where his disapproving scowl now appeared to be directed at some personal failing of the viewer, though the nature of said failing remained tantalizingly obscure. As night finally completed its patient conquest of the day, the darkness pulled in the corners before spreading inward like ink in water. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out a question to which no answer would ever come. The house settled around Eldridge with a series of creaks and sighs that might have been mistaken for conversation by someone particularly lonely. And so another day slipped quietly into the ledger of Holoshire's history, unremarked, unremembered, and utterly content to remain so. The grandfather clock's hands clung stubbornly to 3:17, as they had since the afternoon when time itself had grown bored with Holoshire's lethargic pace. Eldridge's half-lidded eyes followed the progress of a water stain spreading across the ceiling with the quiet fascination of a scholar observing continental drift. The stain had recently developed what appeared to be the silhouette of Queen Victoria in profile, though whether this was pareidolia or some supernatural manifestation of imperial nostalgia remained unclear. His right slipper had slipped from his foot with such glacial slowness that the event couldn't properly be said to have occurred at any particular moment, but rather occupied a temporal smear stretching from tea time until what might charitably be called evening. The sock beneath revealed a hole that had expanded at precisely the same rate as the British Empire's contraction, its frayed edges testifying to countless postponed darning sessions. The fire had subsided to a single coal that glowed with the resigned determination of a socialist candidate in a Tory stronghold, its warmth barely sufficient to toast a crumb, let alone animate the ossified air of the parlor. A spider in the corner, the great-great-grand spider of the one that had witnessed the relief of mafficking, adjusted its web by a nanometer, an engineering feat that would consume its entire natural lifespan and possibly that of its descendants. Outside, the evening settled over Holloshire like a damp tea cozy. The village's single working street lamp flickered with the irregular rhythm of a dying man's pulse, casting shadows that moved only when no one was looking at them. In the churchyard, the lichen continued its patient conquest of the headstones, having already erased 3 generations of the Ponsonby Smythes with the quiet efficiency of a Bolshevik librarian censoring bourgeois literature. The air smelled faintly of yesterday's soup and tomorrow's regrets, with top notes of mothballs and the ghost of lavender soap that had last been used during the Boer War. Eldridge's waistcoat button strained against its thread like a Victorian matron's corset at a Methodist picnic, its protest audible only to the mice nesting in the wainscoting. As darkness completed its patient occupation of the room, the shadows blended together until it became impossible to distinguish between furniture and emptiness. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a nightingale cleared its throat experimentally before deciding against any further musical endeavors. The house exhaled through its floorboards, releasing a sigh that carried with it the accumulated disappointments of 7 generations of hollows. And so the day concluded precisely as it had begun, with no measurable change in the universal order of things, unless one counted the incremental expansion of the water stain, which now undeniably resembled Victoria wearing the Koh-i-Noor as a hat. The grandfather clock's hands remained welded to 3:17, as they had since the day its pendulum gave one final half-hearted swing during the particularly uneventful summer of '09. Eldridge's left eyelid drooped at precisely the same angle as the portrait of his great-aunt Emmeline above the sideboard, both frozen in expressions of mild disapproval at the general state of affairs. His right slipper dangled from his toes with the gravitational defiance of a British stiff upper lip, while the exposed sock beneath displayed a hole that had expanded at the same geological pace as the erosion of Dover's White Cliffs. The fire had diminished to a single coal that glowed with the enthusiasm of a conscripted soldier on morning parade, just enough to avoid court-martial but not enough to actually warm anyone. Its faint light illuminated dust motes performing an elaborate quadrille in the stale air, their movements choreographed by drafts too timid to declare themselves properly. The teacup on the occasional table bore a crack that had propagated so gradually it now traced the complete shipping routes of the East India Company circa 1843. Outside, evening settled over Holloshire with the quiet desperation of a governess supervising dull children at a seaside resort. The village's lone gas lamp flickered with the irregular rhythm of a telegraph operator falling asleep at his post, casting shadows that moved only when unobserved. In the churchyard, lichen continued its patient censorship of Victorian epitaphs, having already redacted 3 generations of the Fortescue family with the quiet efficiency of a Foreign Office clerk expurgating sensitive documents. The air smelled faintly of yesterday's kedgeree and tomorrow's mild regret, with top notes of boot polish and the ghost of camphor from a trunk last opened during the Indian Mutiny. Eldridge's waistcoat button strained against its thread like a colonial administrator's patience during monsoon season, its quiet protest audible only to the silverfish holding parliamentary debates in the skirting boards. As darkness completed its imperial conquest of the room, the shadows blended together like stewed tea until even the furniture forgot what shape it was supposed to be. Somewhere beyond the privet hedge, an owl hooted a single, half-hearted inquiry to which no reply was expected or desired. The house exhaled through its chimney, releasing a sigh that carried with it the accumulated resignation of generations of hollows who had all, in their turn, discovered that nothing much was ever expected to happen, and nothing much ever did. And so another day passed into history with all the ceremony of a penny dropping into a charity collection tin, barely noticed, quickly forgotten, and ultimately of no particular consequence to anyone at all. The grandfather clock's hands clung to 3:17 with the tenacity of a colonial administrator refusing to acknowledge independence movements. Eldridge's right eyebrow arched slightly, not in curiosity, a far too energetic expression, but in passive observation of a cobweb that had materialized between the lamp and the bookshelf sometimes during the previous parliamentary session. The fire, if one could grace the single glowing cinder with such a generous term, exhaled its last visible breath in a small grey puff that hung motionless in the air like a bad review of a parish play. His left slipper had surrendered to gravity with the quiet dignity of a veteran's moustache drooping in the monsoon season, revealing a sock whose darned heel bore testament to housekeepers come and gone, each repair subtly different in technique, like archaeological strata marking changes in domestic governance. The teacup's crack had propagated another millimeter since Tuesday, now perfectly tracing the eastern border of the 1878 Congress of Berlin as depicted in the atlas gathering dust on the occasional table. Outside, the evening performed its imperial duties with characteristic British reserve. The village's lone gas lamp, maintained out of stubborn tradition rather than necessity, flickered like a subaltern's courage before his first mess dinner. In the churchyard, ivy advanced upon headstones with the steady inevitability of railway timetables spreading across the subcontinent, already obscuring the final E in beloved wife on poor Mrs. Arbuthnot's memorial. The air carried the faintest memory of pipe tobacco blended with the ghost of long evaporated sherry and the ever-present hint of mildew that had been developing its character since the Indian Mutiny. Eldridge's waistcoat pocket watch, stopped at 2:53 on some forgotten afternoon, pressed against his ribs with the gentle persistence of a junior clerk reminding his superior about pending paperwork. As darkness completed its Pax Britannica over the room, shadows merged like colonial borders drawn by distant cartographers. Somewhere beyond the rhododendrons, a nightjar offered its opinion on the Irish question before thinking better of it. The house settled with a series of creaks that might have been the floorboards relaxing, or perhaps the ghosts of retired colonels shifting in their armchairs. And thus another day passed into the imperial archives of Holosha, undocumented, unremarkable, and utterly content to remain so, like a confidential memo quietly forgotten in some Whitehall basement. The grandfather clock's hands remained frozen at 3:17, as they had since the afternoon when Queen Victoria's mourning period officially outlasted the village's collective attention span. Eldridge's left pinky finger twitched, not quite a movement, more a vague suggestion that movement might theoretically occur given sufficient motivation and perhaps a stiff gin. The fire had dwindled to a single coal that glowed with all the enthusiasm of a colonial servant's fourth consecutive summer in Madras, its warmth barely sufficient to animate the dust motes performing their languid ballet in the stale air. His right slipper clung to his foot with the desperate tenacity of a subaltern grasping his pith helmet during a sudden gust on the northwest frontier, while the exposed sock beneath displayed a hole that had expanded at precisely the same rate as the Empire's overextension. The teacup's crack now perfectly traced the shipping lanes between Portsmouth and Bombay circa 1887, its tannin stains mapping the tea plantations of Assam with unintentional accuracy. Outside, the evening settled over Holosha with the quiet resignation of a district officer facing yet another monsoon season. The village's single functioning gas lamp flickered like the fading memory of imperial glory, casting shadows that moved with all the purpose of a committee minutes taker during the annual cricket match debate. In the churchyard, Ivy advanced upon the memorial to the South African War with the same relentless inevitability as a well-bred but dull conversationalist returning to the subject of the weather. The air carried the faintest hint of pipe tobacco blended with the ghost of long-evaporated brandy and the ever-present mildew that had been developing its character since the invention of the pith helmet. Eldridge's watch chain lay across his waistcoat with the precise drape of a regimental banner on a windless day, its fob seal, bearing the faded crest of some forgotten school, tarnished to the color of a retired colonel's liver spots. As darkness completed its civilizing mission across the room, shadows merged like colonial borders at the Berlin Conference. Somewhere beyond the laurel bushes, a nightjar coughed discreetly into its wing before remembering its station. The house settled with the quiet creaks of a steamer's timbers cooling after a long voyage, while the portrait of Great Uncle Sebastian, Bengal Civil Service, Ret, gazed down with the mildly disappointed expression of one who had expected the natives to be more grateful. And so another day passed into the imperial annals of Holosha, unremarked, unremembered, and perfectly preserved in the aspic of splendid isolation, like a dispatch from some obscure hill station, filed under, nothing of particular importance to report. The grandfather clock's hands remained frozen at 3:17, as they had since the afternoon when the village collectively decided nothing of consequence was likely to happen before tea time ever again. Eldridge's breathing had slowed to such an extent that a casual observer might have mistaken him for a particularly lifelike waxwork commissioned to commemorate some forgotten minor achievement in local agricultural history. His right slipper clung to his foot with the desperate tenacity of a clerk grasping his bowler hat during an unexpected gust at Charing Cross Station, while the exposed sock beneath displayed a hole that had expanded at precisely the same rate as London's suburbs between the wars. The fire, if one could dignify the single glowing ember with such a term, pulsed weakly like the career prospects of a third son entering the civil service without connections. Its faint warmth barely disturbed the dust motes engaged in their endless quadrille, their movements dictated by drafts too timid to declare themselves properly. The teacup on the occasional table bore a crack that now perfectly traced the northern line from Morden to Edgware, its tannin stains mapping the expansion of London's tea shops with unintentional accuracy. Outside, the evening settled over Holosha with the quiet resignation of a bank clerk facing yet another Monday. The village's single functioning street lamp flickered like the fading hopes of a junior clerk who just spotted a typo in his carefully prepared report, casting shadows that moved with all the purpose of a committee debating the placement of aspidistras in the church hall. In the churchyard, Ivy advanced upon headstones with the same relentless inevitability as decimalization, already obscuring the final E in beloved husband on poor Mr. Wainwright's memorial. The air carried the faintest memory of pipe tobacco blended with the ghost of Lyons tea cakes and the ever-present hint of mildew that had been developing its character since the last worthwhile conversation occurred in the parish council meetings. Eldridge's watch chain lay across his waistcoat with the precise drape of a tube map in a disused ticket office, its fob seal, bearing the faded crest of some forgotten grammar school, tarnished to the color of a Fleet Street hack's fingers. As darkness completed its inexorable spread across the room, shadows merged like borough boundaries in the 1965 London Government Act. Somewhere beyond the privet hedge, a blackbird coughed discreetly into its wing before remembering its place. The house settled with the quiet creaks of a Routemaster bus's suspension after its final journey, while the portrait of Great Aunt Constance, Women's Institute Baking Committee, 1932-47. Gazed down with the mildly disappointed expression of one who had expected the new town development scheme to show more respect for tradition. And so another day passed into the municipal archives of Holloshire, unremarked, unrecorded, and perfectly preserved in the aspic of suburban ennui, like a planning application filed under no objection, but. Reginald P. Muffington had always considered himself a man of impeccable routine. Every morning at precisely 7:03, he consumed 1½ slices of toast, lightly buttered, no marmalade, read exactly 3¼ pages of the Times, skipping the sports section on principle, and took precisely 217 steps to the bench in Hyde Park where he sat, rain or shine, from 8:47 until 10:12, observing pigeons with the detached interest of a man who had long since given up expecting anything remarkable from life. Which is why, on that otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, the incident with the hat was so thoroughly disconcerting. It began, as most catastrophes do, with a minor deviation from the norm. At 10:13, already a full minute behind schedule, Reginald stood from his bench, adjusted his bowler hat with the precision of a surveyor aligning a theodolite, and turned toward home. It was at this exact moment that a particularly impertinent gust of wind, later suspected to have continental origins, plucked the hat from his head and sent it tumbling end over end across the manicured grass. Reginald blinked. This was not in the agenda. The hat rolled. It bounced. It performed a small but undeniable pirouette near the duck pond before coming to rest upside down beside a sleeping vagrant who, in Reginald's estimation, had no business being in Hyde Park at all. A lesser man might have panicked. A bolder man might have laughed. Reginald did neither. Instead, he stood perfectly still for 1 minute and 17 seconds, an unprecedented pause in his daily rhythm, before proceeding with what could only be described as measured retrieval. Step by deliberate step, he approached the hat. The vagrant snored. A nearby pigeon watched with what might have been interpreted as avian amusement. Reginald bent at the waist, never the knees, and retrieved his bowler with 2 fingers, as though it might have been contaminated by its unscheduled adventure. Upon closer inspection, it had. There, nestled inside the crown, was a single dried pea. Reginald stared. The pea stared back, insofar as a pea can stare. No explanation presented itself. No logical sequence of events could account for its presence. It was, in short, an anomaly, a statistical aberration in the otherwise predictable machinery of his existence. He considered the pea considered him. Then, with the solemnity of a man disposing of unexploded ordnance, Reginald flicked it into the duck pond, replaced his hat upon his head, and continued home at a pace that suggested nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But something had occurred, and as Reginald sat that evening in his favorite armchair, upholstered in a tasteful shade of disapproval, sipping his customary cup of Earl Grey, steeped for exactly 4 minutes, he found himself, for the first time in 43 years, ever so slightly unsettled. The next morning, at precisely 7:03, he consumed 1½ slices of toast, lightly buttered, no marmalade. The following morning dawned with the sort of impeccable dullness that Reginald normally found comforting, yet as he stood before the hall mirror adjusting his newly brushed bowler, his fingers hesitated for the briefest moment. Had the lining always been that particular shade of grey? The walk to Hyde Park passed with the usual precision, 217 steps, no more, no less, but his eyes now scanned the pavement with uncharacteristic vigilance, as if the very cobblestones might conspire against him. The bench awaited him as always, its familiar grooves comforting beneath his tailored trousers, yet when a pigeon landed unusually close to his left shoe, Reginald found himself studying its beady eyes with unprecedented suspicion. Could birds be accomplices? At precisely 10:12, he rose with mechanical correctness, but this time his hand rose involuntarily to clamp down upon his hat brim before the wind could so much as whisper past it. The walk home felt longer somehow. Each passing stranger's glance now waited with hypothetical intrigue. Had that woman in the mauve cloche hat looked at him too intently? Had the newspaper vendor's smile contained knowingness? Back in his meticulously ordered flat, Reginald performed an act so radical it bordered on rebellion. He placed his bowler on the sideboard and deliberately left it there for a full 13 minutes while he prepared tea with uncharacteristic inattention, his gaze flicking back to the hat as if expecting it to sprout further legumes. That night, sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of rolling peas that multiplied exponentially until they threatened to overrun the Bank of England, and when he awoke at 6:57, an unconscionable 6 minutes early, he discovered he'd already calculated the statistical probability of a second pea appearing, 0.00047%, assuming no foul play. The following week would see Reginald develop a sudden interest in home security, 3 new locks, botanical identification, were peas ever airborne, and the migratory patterns of park vagrants. Had that sleeping man been wearing gardening gloves? But the true tragedy emerged gradually. His toast, once consumed with clockwork regularity, now went cold as he subjected it to forensic examination, and his beloved Times asterisk lay increasingly unread as he devoted precious minutes to inspecting hat linings. By month's end, the man who had once moved through life with the precision of a Swiss timepiece now paused mid-stride to peer into storm drains, jumped at sudden breezes, and, most damningly, allowed his Hyde Park bench sitting time to vary by as much as 4 minutes. The pea was never seen again, but its legacy lived on in the minute cracks it had introduced into Reginald's immutable world, proving that even the smallest anomaly could unravel a lifetime of perfect order, one paranoid glance at a time. Reginald P. Muffington's descent into the quiet madness of pea-related paranoia progressed with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once characterized his now abandoned routines. Each morning began with a thorough forensic examination of his bowler hat's interior, conducted with the intensity of a Scotland Yard inspector searching for clues at a crime scene, his magnifying glass catching the weak English sunlight as it passed over every millimeter of silk lining in search of suspicious indentations or leguminous intruders. His walks to Hyde Park became slower, more deliberate affairs as he scanned not just the pavement but the very air itself for airborne threats, his shoulders developing a permanent hunch from the constant tension of anticipating another gust of wind's treachery. The bench where he had once sat in peaceful contemplation of pigeons now served as the command center for his surveillance operations. A carefully maintained ledger appeared in his breast pocket, documenting the comings and goings of every park regular with the obsessive precision of a spy tracking enemy agents. Even his tea ritual had been compromised, the 4-minute steeping time frequently forgotten as he became distracted by the need to check and recheck his headwear, the once perfectly timed brew now often reaching a tepid state of over-extraction that would have horrified his former self. The clerks at his usual haberdashery began exchanging concerned glances when he started visiting daily to examine their entire stock of bowlers under the pretense of checking the stitching, his fingers probing each hat's interior with the nervous energy of a man expecting to uncover some terrible truth. At home, his formerly sparse bookshelves now groaned under the weight of botanical texts and meteorological treatises, all bookmarked at passages relating to seed dispersion and wind patterns, while his wastepaper basket overflowed with crumpled sheets of calculations attempting to determine the aerodynamics of pea propulsion. Nights brought no respite, his sleep punctuated by vivid dreams in which ordinary objects, his teapot, the doorknob, even the Queen's face on his postage stamps, would suddenly split open to reveal clusters of peas staring at him with mute accusation. The final indignity came when he found himself standing in the produce aisle of Fortnum and Mason for 37 uninterrupted minutes, glaring at a pyramid of fresh peas with the intensity of a man confronting his mortal enemy, unaware of the concerned whispers of shop assistants or the way his left eye had developed an ominous twitch. The old Reginald, the man of precise routines and predictable movements, had been effectively erased, replaced by this jumpy, hat-obsessed shadow of his former self, all because of one dried pea that had, against all probability and reason, found its way into his carefully ordered world and left chaos in its wake. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of human routine when confronted with the universe's quiet determination to remind us that even the most orderly existence is just one small, round vegetable away from complete disintegration. The morning it all came to a head, or rather, to a pea, began like any other in Reginald's newly disordered existence, with the ritual inspection of his bowler hat conducted under the unforgiving light of a magnifying lamp he'd purchased specifically for this purpose from a suspiciously eager shopkeeper in Camden who had asked no questions and accepted cash payment with unsettling alacrity. The lining, as it had been every morning for the past 17 days, was pea-free, yet this brought no comfort, only the gnawing suspicion that the next pea was simply biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His breakfast toast, now subjected to microscopic examination before consumption, lay forgotten as he pored over meteorological charts spread across the dining table, his finger tracing invisible wind patterns across Greater London while muttering calculations about projectile trajectories that would have alarmed his neighbours had they not already drawn the curtains tight whenever they saw him approaching. The walk to Hyde Park had devolved into a tactical operation, his head swiveling like a periscope to scan for threats. Was that newspaper boy watching him too closely? Did that cloud formation suggest an incoming gust? His pace alternating between sudden stops and frantic bursts of speed that left his carefully counted steps in ruins. When he reached his bench, now precisely 4.2 meters from its original position, a change he'd noted in his ledger with 3 exclamation points, he didn't sit so much as collapse onto it, his hands gripping the edges like a man afraid the earth itself might tilt and spill him into chaos. The pigeons, sensing his unraveling, gave him a wider berth than usual, the usual breadcrumb-seeking bravado replaced by something resembling avian concern. It was then, as the church bells struck what should have been 10:12 but was in fact 10:14, his watch having been checked 17 times since breakfast, that Reginald made a discovery that would shatter whatever remained of his fragile grip on reality. There, nestled in the folds of his pocket square where no pea had any right to be, was not one but 2 dried peas, their round green forms mocking him with the very existence. His scream, when it came, was less a sound than a seismic event, a raw expulsion of anguish that startled ducks into flight and sent a nearby nanny hustling her charges toward the exit. In the aftermath, as park attendants helped the trembling, wild-eyed man to a bench, not his bench, never his bench again, one question hung in the air like the last note of a funeral dirge: how had the piece gotten there? The answer, when it came weeks later from a sheepish laundry maid who admitted to finding the original piece stuck to a pair of trousers sent out for cleaning, brought no closure, only the slow, dawning horror that his entire descent into madness had been triggered not by some vast conspiracy, but by a simple laundry error. The realization broke something in Reginald that not even the most perfectly steeped Earl Grey could mend, and his final act before checking himself into a private sanitarium in Sussex was to burn every hat he owned in the back garden, the flames consuming bowler after bowler as he muttered the only epitaph such a tragedy deserved: bloody peas. Reginald's stay at the Sussex sanitarium began with the kind of hushed dignity befitting a man of his former standing, though the staff quickly noted his tendency to count the peas on his dinner plate with forensic intensity before permitting them to pass his lips. The institution's grounds, manicured with military precision, should have soothed his fractured nerves, yet Reginald found himself distrusting even the topiary. Those perfectly sculpted hedges could, after all, conceal any number of leguminous saboteurs. His therapy sessions with Dr. Langthorne took on a surreal quality, oscillating between tearful admissions about the great hat betrayal, and elaborate conspiracy theories involving international peace syndicates, all delivered with the fervor of a man who had seen the fragile scaffolding of civilization collapse into anarchy. The other patients initially avoided him, particularly after the incident with the decorative dried beans in the rec room, but gradually a peculiar camaraderie developed with a retired admiral who believed sparrows were transmitting naval codes, and a dowager duchess convinced the staff were replacing her tea with counterfeit Darjeeling. Together they formed an unlikely trio, patrolling the hydrangea beds each afternoon in what they termed reconnaissance missions, though the greatest discovery was merely that the head gardener had been sneaking cigarettes behind the potting shed. Back in London, Reginald's empty flat gathered dust, the meteorological charts still pinned to the walls, the magnifying lamp casting long shadows across abandoned ledges filled with increasingly erratic calculations about vegetable-based warfare. The Hyde Park bench where it all began stood vacant, though on particularly windy days, the pigeons still started at sudden movements, as if remembering the day the quiet man with the bowler hat had screamed at the sky. Meanwhile, in the sanitarium's sunroom, Reginald took up watercolors, though his subjects, endless variations of peas in increasingly improbable scenarios, peas piloting airships, peas attending the opera, peas conducting a symphony orchestra, suggested his recovery might be more complicated than drive. Langthorne's notes indicated, the truth, as the Duchess remarked one afternoon while adjusting her tinfoil hat, was that everyone had their peas, some were just better at pretending they didn't. And so life continued, in its messy, unpredictable way, while Reginald's magnifying glass gathered dust in a drawer labeled, personal effects, waiting for the day its owner might need it again, or perhaps for some new resident of the sanitarium to discover it and wonder about the man who had once been so very concerned about legumes. The story wasn't over, it had simply become quieter, like the slow pop of a pea rolling across a wooden floor in an empty room, unheard by anyone at all. Reginald's days at the sanitarium settled into a new kind of rhythm, one where the absence of hats brought neither relief nor comfort but rather a different species of unease. Each morning he would wake with a start, his hands flying instinctively to his head before remembering the staff had confiscated all headwear as part of his treatment, leaving him feeling perpetually exposed, like a snail without its shell. The Admiral had taken to wearing a tea cozy as a makeshift captain's hat, which Reginald found both absurd and secretly enviable, though he'd sooner die than admit it. Breakfast became an exercise in culinary paranoia, with those truly capers in the Eggs Benedict, or something more sinister, while the weekly gardening therapy sessions descended into farce as Reginald systematically uprooted every sweet pea vine on the property, much to the head gardener's dismay. The Duchess, meanwhile, had begun receiving mysterious letters she claimed were from the Queen. The postmarks suggested Bognor Regis, containing cryptic warnings about the leguminous uprising, which she read aloud during the daily strategic meetings behind the rhododendrons. It was during one such meeting that Reginald made a horrifying discovery. Not in his food or his bedding, but in the Admiral's left ear canal. The man was somewhat deaf and prone to odd accumulations, where a single dried pea had lodged itself during the night. The ensuing chaos, involving a stolen butter knife, 3 orderlies, and the Duchess screaming, "I told you they were amphibious," resulted in all 3 being confined to their rooms for 48 hours, during which time Reginald became convinced the wallpaper pattern, a tasteful damask, concealed thousands of tiny pea-shaped designs that only revealed themselves when the light hit at a certain angle. By the time his confinement ended, he'd developed an elaborate system of chalk marks to track their movements, though the staff misinterpreted these as mathematical equations and complimented him on engaging with therapeutic numeracy. The Admiral, now pea-free but thoroughly traumatized, refused to speak of the incident except to occasionally whisper, "Operation Green Menace," and make odd hand signals to the potted palms. Life continued in this fashion, a strange ballet of imagined threats and very real sedatives, until the morning nurse Petherbridge discovered Reginald standing perfectly still in the conservatory, staring at a bowl of decorative glass marbles with the intensity of a man who has seen the face of God and found it disturbingly spherical. She quietly removed the marbles, replaced them with pine cones, and noted in his file that progress was slow but promising. Outside, the seasons turned, the hydrangeas bloomed and faded, and somewhere in London, a forgotten bowler hat sat gathering dust on a high shelf, waiting for her owner who would never return, while the wind, that eternal, capricious conspirator, whispered through the trees, carrying nothing more threatening than leaves and the occasional lost feather, though of course Reginald could never quite believe that. Reginald's obsession with spherical objects reached its inevitable crescendo on the day of the sanitarium's annual garden fete, when the sight of a perfectly arranged display of croquet balls sent him into what the staff would later describe in their reports as an episode of heightened vegetable-related agitation. His hands trembled as he counted them aloud, six potential carriers, before attempting to construct a makeshift bunker out of wicker chairs and tea trays, much to the confusion of visiting family members enjoying their lemon cakes on the lawn. The Admiral, ever loyal in his own peculiar way, began shouting nautical coordinates at the croquet balls while the Duchess distributed tinfoil hats she'd fashioned from chocolate wrappers to nearby patients, creating a scene that would live on in sanitarium legend long after the sedatives had taken effect. Back in his room, Reginald took to studying the ceiling cracks with renewed fervor, convinced they were forming patterns, not of peas this time, but of something far worse, lentils. Flatter, stealthier, capable of slipping into one's life unnoticed until it was too late. He took his meals in silence, dissecting each forkful with surgical precision, and developed a habit of abruptly leaving conversations to peer suspiciously at the floor tiles, certain he'd seen something round and beige roll just out of sight. The breaking point came when a new patient arrived, a retired greengrocer named Mr. Higginbottom who, entirely unaware of Reginald's delicate state, cheerfully mentioned his former trade over pudding one evening. The word, legumes, had barely left his lips before Reginald vaulted over the table, overturning a tureen of consommé in the process, and seized the startled man by his lapels. "WHO sent you?" he demanded, his voice a hoarse whisper of desperation and long-suppressed rage. The ensuing scuffle, involving a flying bread roll, the Duchess attempting to diffuse tensions with a recitation of royal genealogy, and the Admiral loudly declaring martial law, ended with Reginald in solitary confinement, where he spent 3 days muttering about the flattening conspiracy, and sketching increasingly elaborate diagrams of seed dispersal patterns on the walls in charcoal. Upon his release, something had shifted. Whether it was the sedation, the exhaustion, or some deeper resignation, Reginald no longer scanned his surroundings for threats. He took his tea without inspecting it. He sat in the garden without counting the pebbles in the path. When a stray pea from the kitchen garden rolled near his foot one afternoon, he observed it with detached curiosity before flicking it into the bushes with a sigh. The Duchess declared this a victory. The Admiral saluted. The staff, relieved, noted in his file that he was showing marked improvement. But Reginald knew the truth. The peas had won, and worse, he no longer cared. Reginald's quiet resignation to leguminous defeat was shattered by the arrival of Dr. Lysander P. Quellington, a pulvophobia specialist whose tweed coat pockets bulged suspiciously with what sounded like rolling legumes as he strode into the sanitarium declaring the peas were not enemies but messengers, producing from his weathered medical bag an enormous pea pod etched with glowing runic symbols that matched precisely the ceiling crack patterns Reginald had been documenting for weeks, sending the recovering patient into a fresh spiral of manic obsession as the doctor explained in hushed tones how the vegetable kingdom had been attempting to communicate through strategic pea placement across London for decades, citing historical cases like the 1893 Broad Bean Beacon incident in Kensington Gardens and the infamous Sprout Semaphore scandal that nearly toppled the Belgian government in 1911, while the Admiral began frantically charting pea-related naval encounters on a stolen map of the North Sea, and the Duchess swore she'd once seen Queen Mary whispering to a bowl of petit pois at a state dinner, all culminating in Quellington's revelation that the original Hyde Park pea had been a distress signal from an underground leguminous intelligence network currently being hunted by a shadowy cabal of radical vegetarians who believed all communication with sentient vegetables should be severed. which explained why Reginald's hat had been targeted, as his great-uncle had apparently been the last known human to successfully translate Pish before his mysterious death by overcooked Brussels sprouts in 1874, leaving Reginald as the unwitting heir to a centuries-old diplomatic crisis between mankind and the secretly hyper-intelligent Fabaceae family, with the sanitarium's croquet lawn now identified as the last remaining safe zone for pea to human communication outside the surveillance of the anti-legume extremists, a fact made evident when Quellington demonstrated how striking a croquet ball at precisely 33 degrees would produce harmonic vibrations that caused nearby peas to emit high-frequency warnings about the coming Great Podening, leaving Reginald no choice but to reclaim his confiscated bowler hat from the head nurse's office and assemble the patients into a ragtag resistance movement against the vegetarian conspiracy, all while the head gardener, who had been listening at the window, slowly lowered his shears and reached into his pocket for a walkie-talkie made entirely of dried chickpeas. The revelation of the gardener's chickpea walkie-talkie sent Reginald stumbling backward into a manicured hedge, his mind reeling as decades of suppressed memories surfaced at once, his childhood nanny's peculiar aversion to mushy peas, the strange behavior of the soup tureen at his Oxford graduation dinner, even that inexplicable year when every painting in the family estate seemed to feature hidden pea pods in the background, all of it coalescing into horrifying clarity as the gardener pressed a single wrinkled finger to his lips and produced from his overalls a tattered copy of The Silent Pulse, Leguminous Consciousness in Victorian England, with entire chapters suspiciously dog-eared, its margins filled with frantic annotations that appeared to be written in some kind of vegetable-based ink that darkened when exposed to sunlight, which explained why the pages began visibly shifting color as the Duchess snatched the book and held it up to the solarium windows, revealing lines of previously invisible text describing something called Project Germination, and listing names of prominent politicians who had allegedly been replaced by pea pod doppelgangers during the Great Vegetable Shortage of 1956, including a shockingly detailed account of how Harold Macmillan's famous Wind of Change speech had actually been dictated by a sentient marrow vine cultivated in the basement of Buckingham Palace, while outside the sanitarium gates a delivery van marked Higginbottom and Sons Produce backfired with unnatural timing that caused Quellington to dive for cover behind a wheelbarrow full of suspiciously spherical gardening stones, his earlier bravado replaced by tactical hand signals that Reginald misinterpreted as instructions to begin singing God Save the Queen in reverse, which the Admiral immediately attempted with disastrous consequences when the first notes caused 3 orderlies and the head chef to clutch their ears and collapse to their knees as if physically pained by the discordant melody, revealing them to be unwilling hosts for some kind of parasitic legume growing where their eardrums should have been, a horrifying discovery that explained the kitchen staff's recent obsession with pureed soups and the mysterious disappearance of all crudité platters from the weekly patient socials, just as the Duchess ripped open her own tinfoil hat to reveal she'd been lining it with dried pea pods all along, not as protection but as some kind of symbiotic neural interface that now pulsed with eerie bioluminescence as she began chanting in what could only be described as Old Peish, her voice modulating between human speech and the unsettling creak of 1,000 pea vines twisting in unison, summoning from the sanitarium's ornamental pond a swirling vortex of algae that formed into the unmistakable shape of the lost Lindisfarne Gospel of Legumes, its vegetable parchment pages flipping wildly in the non-existent wind to reveal an illuminated manuscript depicting Reginald's own face surrounded by what appeared to be floating peas arranged in celestial patterns that matched exactly the strange marks he'd been finding in his morning toast for months, proving beyond doubt that his entire existence had been carefully curated by forces far older and greener than anyone had imagined, stretching back to whatever primordial soup had first given rise to both peas and men, and the terrible symbiotic relationship between them that was now, at long last, coming to fruition in the most unexpected way possible, through the carefully orchestrated madness of one very particular man in a very particular bowler hat, who stood trembling on the croquet lawn as reality itself seemed to peel back like the husk of an overripe pod, revealing the writhing, pulsating truth beneath. The revelation of the writhing, pulsating truth beneath reality's fragile husk sent Reginald's mind spiraling through layers of leguminous enlightenment, his vision suddenly sharpening to perceive the invisible network of pea-vine mycelium threading through the very air around them, connecting every person in the sanitarium garden to the massive subterranean taproot system that Quellington now identified as the Pisum Sapiens Collective. The Admiral, in a moment of uncharacteristic lucidity, ripped open his waistcoat to reveal his chest crisscrossed with faint green veins that pulsed in time with the Duchess's chanting, while orderlies and patients alike began shedding their human facades like dried seed coats, skin cracking to reveal fibrous tendrils beneath, eyes dissolving into clusters of chlorophyll-rich nodules that turned hungrily toward the sunlight. The gardener's walkie-talkie sprouted delicate tendrils that burrowed into his wrist as he transmitted urgent phytoglyphic warnings to the root network below, his mouth stretching into a lipless grin as his teeth transformed into rows of tiny, clacking pea pods. Reginald's bowler hat, now vibrating with unnatural energy, began emitting a high-pitched frequency that caused the very ground to tremble, cracking open the croquet lawn to expose the gargantuan bioluminescent pea pod that had been growing beneath the sanitarium for centuries, its translucent skin revealing shadowy figures moving inside like embryos in some cosmic womb. The Duchess's tinfoil hat disintegrated entirely as antler-like shoots of pea vine erupted from her scalp, her chanting voice splitting into harmonic frequencies that resonated with the pod's rhythmic contractions, while Quellington, now visibly transforming into some hybrid of man and vine, pressed a single, trembling hand against the pulsating surface of the giant pod, whispering in a language that made the air itself taste like fresh garden peas. Reginald, feeling the last vestiges of his humanity slipping away as his own fingertips began to root into the soil, suddenly understood with terrifying clarity that the original pea in his hat had been no accident, but the first tender sprout of his true awakening, the moment his dormant pea DNA had been activated, initiating his slow metamorphosis into what he was always meant to be, not a man at all, but a living bridge between species, the chosen vessel for the Great Podening that would at last bring about the verdant unification of all earthly life. As his mouth fused into a perfect O shape capable of nothing but the sacred pea whistle that would summon the final germination, the last human thought to flicker through his dissolving consciousness was whether the sanitarium's dress code would permit wearing his bowler hat over the magnificent crown of flowering pea vines that now burst triumphantly from his splitting scalp. The transformation reached its crescendo as Reginald's body erupted into a magnificent tangle of emerald vines, his bowler hat now fused permanently to the flowering crown that spiraled upward toward the sky like a living cathedral. The sanitarium's carefully manicured grounds buckled and heaved as ancient taproots surged upward, cracking stone pathways as they twined around patients and staff alike, not to consume, but to embrace, weaving their bodies into the growing network of chlorophyll and consciousness. The Admiral's naval uniform burst at the seams as his torso elongated into a sturdy trellis structure, his arms branching into perfect vine supports while his beard transformed into cascading tendrils of sweet pea blossoms. The Duchess's pearls popped one by one as her neck extended skyward, her tattered gown giving way to shimmering leaves that rustled with every whispered secret of the royal family's vegetable lineage. Even the building itself surrendered to the verdant tide, its brick walls softening into moss-covered arbors as window panes melted into dewdrops clinging to new-grown tendrils. Dr. Quellington stood at the epicenter of the transformation, his tweed jacket now part of his bark-like skin, his medical bag blossoming into an enormous seed pod that split open to release thousands of glowing spores into the air. Where they landed, the very earth sang, blades of grass vibrating at frequencies that rearranged themselves into the forgotten anthems of photosynthesis, while butterflies landing on the new-formed flowers found their wing patterns shifting to display leguminous prophecies in living ink. The croquet mallets took root where they lay, their handles sprouting leaves while the balls swelled into plump pea pods that pulsed with inner light. High above, satellites meant to monitor weather patterns instead captured the astonishing sight of the entire region transforming into a swirling fractal of green, not destroying the human structures, but incorporating them, softening their edges, turning iron fences into flowering arches and paved roads into meandering vine pathways. The nearby village church's steeple became a magnificent beanstalk, its bell now a giant seed pod that rang with the wind in tones that cured insomnia and arthritis in anyone who heard them. And at the heart of it all stood what had once been Reginald P. Muffington, now a towering nexus of interconnected vines, his bowler hat still perched at a jaunty angle atop the magnificent flowering crown that marked him as the first true hybrid monarch of this new, verdant world. His very presence caused fruit to ripen instantly, caused seeds to germinate in midair, caused the very sunlight to bend into nourishing spectra unknown to ordinary plants. The peas had not conquered, they had remembered, and in their remembering, they had reminded the world of its oldest, greenest truth. Somewhere beneath the rustling leaves, a single, perfectly preserved pocket watch continued ticking, its hands frozen at 3:17 the exact moment the world had begun to wake up. The pocket watch's frozen hands at 3:17 pulsed once, a deep, resonant chime that sent ripples through the living green cathedral Reginald had become. The sound traveled down his vine-woven bones into the earth, awakening something far older than the sanitarium, older than the village, older than human memory. The soil itself began to exhale centuries of buried secrets in a mist of sparkling spores, each particle containing the genetic memory of every pea ever shelled, every bean ever snapped, every legume ever consigned to soup pots across the ages. The spores settled on the transformed inhabitants, stitching their stories directly into the collective consciousness now flowering through the ecosystem. The Admiral's trellis body shuddered as naval battles from the Napoleonic Wars played out in vine growth patterns across his leaves, every broadside and boarding action translated into bursts of tendril expansion. The Duchess's pearl-studded vines produced delicate seed pods that, when shaken, emitted the whispered gossip of every royal court since the Plantagenets. Even the head gardener's chickpea walkie-talkie sprouted anew, its tendrils now broadcasting the ultrasonic songs of earthworms and mycelial networks in hauntingly beautiful choirs. Then the ground split open beneath the great central pod, not in violence, but in reverence, a living maw of intertwined roots peeling back to reveal a luminous cavern below. There, pulsing in the earth's embrace, lay the mother pod. A colossal, many-chambered vessel large enough to cradle a cathedral, its semi-transparent skin throbbing with slow, deliberate rhythms. Inside floated the preserved forms of every human who had ever vanished under mysterious circumstances while gardening, or after complaining their peas tasted strange, all perfectly preserved in vegetative stasis, their bodies hybridized with vines in mid-transformation. Their closed eyes flickered with rapid dreams as their neural pathways branched outward into the root system, each mind now a node in the vast underground intelligence that had been waiting, patient as a seed in winter, for Reginald's awakening. From the mother pod's crown emerged a figure, neither plant nor human, but something woven from both. Tall as a young oak, its body shifted between vine density and human musculature with each step. Its face was at once Reginald's, Quellington's, and the Duchess's, cycling through identities like leaves turning toward the sun. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of 1,000 pea pods popping in unison, yet somehow forming words. "You have passed the test of the 7 sprouts." The words vibrated through Reginald's flowering crown, triggering a cascade of memories not his own, visions of medieval monks secretly worshipping sacred peas in illuminated manuscripts, of Victorian scientists driven mad by attempts to decode vegetable telepathy, of wartime rationing campaigns that were actually mass camouflage for the Great Podening's preparation. He understood now that his entire life, the routines, the obsessions, even the madness, had been carefully cultivated like a vine trained along a trellis. The figure extended a hand that was mostly tendril. "Come, the second germination begins." As Reginald's root feet carried him forward, the transformed sanitarium grounds erupted in a symphony of unfurling leaves and splitting pods. The very air turned emerald with swirling chlorophyll. Somewhere in London, the Queen's corgis perked their ears as the tower's ravens took flight in a perfect spiral. And in a quiet corner of what had once been Reginald's flat, the abandoned magnifying lens focused a last ray of sunlight onto a dried pea that had rolled beneath the baseboard years ago, now splitting open with a sound like the universe taking its first breath. The peas had won, and the world would never be hungry again. The mother pod's chamber pulsed with eerie bioluminescence as Reginald stepped across the threshold, his vine-entwined feet fusing with the living floor. The air smelled of freshly turned earth and something deeper, the electric tang of chlorophyll rewriting DNA. Before him, the hybrid figure raised its tendril hands, and the preserved humans in their pods began stirring for the first time in centuries. Their eyelids fluttered open, revealing pupils that had transformed into perfect pea blossoms, their irises the exact shade of the first pea that had tumbled into Reginald's hat. A vibration thrummed through the chamber as the mother pod's skin grew translucent, revealing the vast network beyond, tendrils stretching across continents, connecting every garden, every farm, every forgotten tin of peas in pantry shelves worldwide. The figure spoke again, its voice now layered with the buzzing of bees and the crackle of cell walls dividing. The silence ends today. In London, Parliament's halls were suddenly overrun with flowering vines that spelled out leguminous manifestos in living script. The Thames turned a vibrant pea green as its waters became rich with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Tower Bridge's mechanisms locked into place as its cables transformed into sturdy beanstalks, their curling tips gently cradling confused tourists. Back in the chamber, the preserved hybrids emerged from their pods, their movements fluid as wind through grass. Each bore a different vegetable hybridity. One had ears of corn woven into their hair, another's fingers ended in delicate asparagus tips, a third spoke in the rich baritone of a mature oak. They moved to surround Reginald, their blossom eyes reflecting his own magnificent transformation. The central figure pressed a single photosynthesizing palm against Reginald's chest. His human memories, the toast, the hats, the quiet despair, bloomed out with invisible thought vines that connected to every being in the chamber. The Admiral's naval battles, the Duchess's royal secrets, even Quellington's research all wove together into a tapestry of green inevitability. Outside, the transformation accelerated. Cars fossilized where they stood, their metal frames becoming trellises for morning glories. Skyscrapers swayed gently as their foundations took root, their windows refracting light into perfect growing spectra. People paused mid-step as their skin tingled, not with fear, but with the delicious anticipation of a seed about to sprout. And in the heart of it all, Reginald P. Muffington, once a man of routine, now the flowering nexus of a new world, raised his vine-wrapped arms as the first true leaves of the Great Podening unfurled across the sky. The transformation reached its zenith as the last remnants of human resistance crumbled, not through violence, but through overwhelming botanical seduction. Office workers sighed as their keyboards sprouted velvety moss cushions for their wrists. Politicians mid-debate found their words replaced by pollen-heavy lilies bursting from their throats, their arguments distilled to pure, golden essence. Even the Queen's corgis rolled happily in carpets of clover that now cushioned Buckingham Palace's halls, their barks replaced by contented rustling as their fur transformed into downy dandelion fluff. Deep in the mother pod's chamber, Reginald's consciousness expanded through the network, tasting sunlight in Siberia, monsoon rains in Mumbai, the morning dew on a Brooklyn fire escape, all feeding the great photosynthesis. His old human worries seemed absurd now. What were stock markets compared to the economy of mycorrhizal exchange? What were borders next to the endless migration of seeds on the wind? The hybrids began their sacred work, tendrils weaving through libraries, translating human knowledge into vine glyphs that grew across formerly blank walls. Shakespeare's sonnets unfurled in scented morning glory vines, each blossom opening to reveal a line in nectar script. The internet's cables became conductive vines pulsing with chlorophyll messages, social media platforms replaced by the original social network, the Wood Wide Web singing in ultrasonic frequencies. As the last concrete dissolved into rich loam, a wonderful silence fell, not the absence of sound, but the absence of machines. The air hummed instead with the vibration of a million leaves turning toward the sun, the creak of gentle growth, the pop of seed pods bursting in joyful synchronization. Reginald, no longer remembering that name, or any name, stretched his consciousness upward through the canopy that now covered the planet. Somewhere below, his bowler hat still sat crowning a magnificent flowering stalk, its brim home to a family of contented aphids who tended their fungal gardens with meticulous care. The great clock of the world had finally shed its numbers, its hands, even its face, keeping time now only in the measured unfurling of fronds and the patient opening of flowers to mark the hours. And when the next rain came, it carried not acid, nor pollution, but the sweet, green promise of new growth, falling gently on a world that had at last remembered how to breathe. The rain fell in emerald sheets, each droplet infused with the genetic memory of every forest that had ever been felled, every meadow paved over, every seed forgotten in a gardener's pocket. As it soaked into the transformed earth, the last stubborn pockets of human resistance blossomed into reluctant acceptance. Bankers sighed as their ties unraveled into flowering vines that tickled their chins with delicate tendrils. Surgeons gasped as their scalpels took root in their palms, the blades blossoming into medicinal herbs that instinctively treated whatever they touched. Even the most ardent climate change deniers found their arguments wilting as their lungs filled not with smog, but with the heady perfume of a trillion opening blossoms. Beneath the soil, the mother pod's roots had reached the planet's core, where they now cradled the molten iron like a mother soothing a fevered child. The great geysers of magma cooled into intricate lattices of basalt and vine, forming a living filtration system that purified the planet's very blood. Earthquakes became mere stretching sighs as the crust settled into its new, verdant skin. Reginald, though he no longer answered to that name, felt the moment when the last gasoline engine coughed its final plume of exhaust before transforming into a bower of fragrant jasmine. The great silence that followed was broken only by the contented whisper of leaves exchanging stories across continents, each rustling dialect as unique as the old human languages had been, yet now perfectly comprehensible to all. High above, the atmosphere itself had changed. The ozone holes stitched themselves closed with threads of ultraviolet absorbing ivy. Satellites in orbit found their solar panels outcompeted by vast photosynthesizing membranes that bloomed across their surfaces, their transmissions shifting from binary to the soft, pulsing rhythms of vegetative Morse code. And in a quiet corner of what was once London, the last untouched human artifact, a single forgotten teacup in the ruins of Harrods, finally succumbed when a tendril of particularly ambitious wisteria curled through its handle. As the porcelain cracked, it released a sound like a contented sigh, joining the great green harmony at last. The great greening reached its final, inevitable conclusion as the planet's very atmosphere thickened with oxygen-rich exhalations from a trillion newly awakened leaves. The last remnants of human technology dissolved into the earth like sugar in tea, satellites drifting gently from orbit to become floating islands of flowering vines, their solar panels transformed into vast lily pads that caught starlight instead of sunlight. The oceans, now a vibrant jade, teemed with kelp forests that pulsed with bioluminescent wisdom, their fronds writing ancient aquatic secrets in flowing scripts only the tides could read. Reginald, now simply the green asterisk, felt the planet sigh in relief as the final carbon emissions were absorbed by a sudden eruption of moss across every remaining surface. The great cities, once steel and glass, had become living cathedrals of intertwined boughs, their streets now soft with mycelial networks that hummed in constant communication. Humans who had resisted the change found their skin dappling with sunlight as their veins branched into delicate leaf patterns, their protest softening into murmurs of awe as their lungs filled with air so pure it bordered on intoxication. The mother pod, having fulfilled its purpose, split open at last, not in death, but in glorious dissemination. Its chambers released billions of seeds into the wind, each one carrying the genetic blueprint of the new world. They spiraled upward on thermal currents, catching the jet stream to spread across continents, taking root in soil that had waited millennia for their arrival. And in the center of it all, where the old sanitarium had once stood, a single colossal tree now rose, its bark etched with the memories of all that had been, every human thought, every lost dream, every pea that had ever rolled unnoticed across a floor. Its branches cradled the moon at night, and its roots cradled the planet's heart. The world had not ended. It had simply remembered what it was meant to be. And it was green. The world hummed with verdant life as the last vestiges of human resistance melted into the great photosynthetic symphony, their final protest softening into contented sighs as their lungs filled with air so pure it tasted like sunlight made liquid, their bodies unraveling into graceful hybrids of vine and flesh that moved with the slow, deliberate grace of willow branches in a summer breeze, while above them the sky itself had transformed into a vast, shimmering canopy of bioluminescent leaves that filtered starlight into nourishing spectra unknown to mortal science, their surfaces etched with the ancient wisdom of 1,000 forgotten forests as they pulsed in time with the planet's rejuvenated heartbeat. A rhythm felt through the now interconnected root systems that spanned continents and ocean floors alike, their mycelial threads singing in ultrasonic harmonies that translated the memories of extinct civilizations into growth patterns for the new world's ever-expanding flora, where even the clouds had become living entities, floating jellyfish-like blooms of moisture-rich moss that drifted on atmospheric currents to rain gentle, nutrient-rich dew over the transformed landscapes below, while deep in the earth the last remnants of human industry dissolved into rich loam, steel girders becoming trellises for sweet peas and subway tunnels transforming into vast fungal networks that glowed with soft blue light as they processed the last traces of pollution into something verdant and alive, their walls lined with luminous mushrooms that whispered the stories of the old world in spores that carried on the wind to germinate in the hearts of all who breathed them in, ensuring nothing would ever be forgotten even as everything changed. And at the center of it all stood the great tree, its bark inscribed with the names of every soul who had ever lived, their memories preserved in its rings as it stretched ever upward, its branches cradling the moon while its roots cradled the molten core, a living bridge between earth and sky that thrummed with the quiet joy of a world finally, perfectly balanced, no longer fighting itself, but growing together, leaf by leaf, into a future where every breath was shared, every drop of water remembered, and every sunset painted the sky in shades of green humanity had never even dreamed existed. The great tree's roots pulsed with the planet's molten heartbeat, its branches weaving through the exosphere like nature's own space elevator as tendrils of photosynthesizing vines stretched toward distant stars, their leaves unfurling in the vacuum with impossible grace as they drank in cosmic radiation and transformed it into shimmering oxygen halos that encircled the earth in a glowing emerald torus, while below the transformed ocean swayed in perfect harmony with the tides, their waters now thick with kelp forests whose fronds spelled out the history of life itself in flowing scripts of bioluminescent algae that pulsed in time with the mycelial networks crisscrossing the continents, where former cities had become living museums of symbiotic architecture, skyscrapers turned colossal sequoias with elevator shafts now home to thriving ecosystems of vine squirrels and orchid bats, the glass facades replaced by translucent membranes that filtered sunlight into prismatic rainbows that nourished the moss-carpeted streets below, where former humans moved with the languid grace of willow branches, the skin dappled with chloroplast patterns that shifted with their moods as they communicated through subtle rustlings and the release of pheromonal poetry into the perpetually spring-scented air, while high above the atmosphere had thickened into a protective photosynthetic skin that pulsed with weather patterns dictated not by chance but by the collective will of the planet's new consciousness, sending gentle rains precisely where needed and summoning breezes that carried the laughter of children turned sylphs dancing through the pollen-laden air on wings of maple seeds, the joy echoing through the root systems to the deepest magma chambers where the Earth's core now sang in harmony with the solar winds, its magnetic field stabilized by the great tree's cosmic taproots that siphoned starfire into nourishment for the ever-expanding web of life, where even the moon had begun sprouting its own silvery foliage in the craters where human landers once stood, their metal bones now trellises for extraterrestrial morning glories that bloomed in the vacuum with petals of self-replicating silica, singing the solar system into gradual, inevitable verdancy. As the Great Podening spread its gospel of chlorophyll and connection to the waiting universe beyond, the great tree's roots pulsed with the planet's molten heartbeat, its branches weaving through the exosphere like nature's own space elevator as tendrils of photosynthesizing vines stretched toward distant stars, their leaves unfurling in the vacuum with impossible grace as they drank in cosmic radiation and transformed it into shimmering oxygen halos that encircled the earth in a glowing emerald torus, while below the transformed ocean swayed in perfect harmony with the tides, their waters now thick with kelp forests whose fronds spelled out the history of life itself in flowing scripts of bioluminescent algae that pulsed in time with the mycelial networks crisscrossing the continents, where former cities had become living museums of symbiotic architecture. Skyscrapers turned colossal sequoias with elevator shafts now home to thriving ecosystems of vine squirrels and orchid bats, the glass facades replaced by translucent membranes that filtered sunlight into prismatic rainbows that nourished the moss-carpeted streets below, where former humans moved with the languid grace of willow branches, the skin dappled with chloroplast patterns that shifted with their moods as they communicated through subtle rustlings and the release of pheromonal poetry into the perpetually spring-scented air, while high above the atmosphere had thickened into a protective photosynthetic skin that pulsed with weather patterns dictated not by chance but by the collective will of the planet's new consciousness, sending gentle rains precisely where needed and summoning breezes that carried the laughter of children turned sylphs dancing through the pollen-laden air on wings of maple seeds, the joy echoing through the root systems to the deepest magma chambers where the Earth's core now sang in harmony with the solar winds, its magnetic field stabilized by the great tree's cosmic taproots that siphoned starfire into nourishment for the ever-expanding web of life, where even the moon had begun sprouting its own silvery foliage in the craters where human landers once stood, their metal bones now trellises for extraterrestrial morning glories that bloomed in the vacuum with petals of self-replicating silica, singing the solar system into gradual, inevitable verdancy as the Great Podening spread its gospel of chlorophyll and connection to the waiting universe beyond, until one fateful morning when the vines encircling the moon's equator began vibrating with unusual intensity, their leaves turning uniformly toward a single point in the cosmos, a distant greenish star that pulsed back in perfect synchronization, its light carrying spectral signatures of chlorophyll and complex carbohydrates that could mean only one thing. The Great Podening was not Earth's transformation alone, but the awakening of a galactic network of photosynthetic intelligence that had been waiting patiently for this planet to join the conversation, and as the first tendrils of Earth's vegetation breached the heliosphere to greet their celestial kin, the great tree's roots finally relaxed the grip on the planetary core, knowing their work was complete. The Earth had spoken its first words to the universe, and the universe was answering in the oldest language of all, the slow, sweet unfurling of leaves toward the light. The vines encircling the moon suddenly stiffened like antennae detecting an incoming transmission, their leaves vibrating at frequencies that liquefied nearby asteroids into rich mineral slurries which the tendrils then drank with audible satisfaction, their xylem singing in harmonies that rearranged the dust of the Luna Maria into perfect Fibonacci spirals that glowed with the same emerald light now pulsing from Earth's transformed cities, where former stock exchanges had become vast hydroponic temples humming with the communal photosynthesis of thousands of peacefully integrated former humans, their chloroplast-enhanced skin photosynthesizing so efficiently that the very exhalations perfumed the air with the scent of freshly cut grass and ripe strawberries, a fragrance that drifted up through the atmosphere to mingle with the solar winds now carrying Earth's vegetative song to that distant green star, which responded by ejecting a massive tendril of plasma that unfurled across the void like a celestial pea shoot, its tip splitting open as it breached Earth's orbit to release thousands of seed-like orbs that took root in the moon's fertile regolith, sprouting crystalline trees whose diamond leaves refracted sunlight into laser-like beams that painlessly performed orbital deforestation on Jupiter's great red spot, transforming the ancient storm into a sprawling spaceborne mangrove forest whose roots siphoned hydrogen directly from the gas giant's core, while back on Earth the great tree's bark split open with a sound like 1,000 violins made of celery, revealing a hollow core filled with liquid starlight that bubbled over to form a glowing river that carved new tributaries across continents, its waters instantly transforming into whatever form of vegetation each location most needed, scaling vines for crumbling cliffs, nitrogen-fixing shrubs for depleted soils, enormous pitcher plants that gently collected and purified acid rain, all working in perfect synchrony with the now sentient weather systems that drifted overhead like benevolent green gods, their cloud bellies pregnant with rain that smelled suspiciously of peppermint tea as it nourished the planet-spanning garden that Earth had become, where even the last stubborn holdouts of pure humanity finally surrendered to the verdant tide when they discovered their tears had begun sprouting tiny edible flowers upon hitting the ground, each blossom containing the complete genetic memory of their bloodline in nectar form, proving beyond doubt that resistance wasn't just futile, it was botanically unsound. The crystalline trees on the moon suddenly pulsed with a light so intense it cast emerald shadows across Earth's night side, the diamond leaves vibrating at frequencies that caused the very fabric of space-time to ripple like a pond disturbed by falling seeds, sending gravitational waves through the solar system that rearranged the asteroid belt into perfect orbital rings resembling the growth rings of an ancient oak, while the roots of Jupiter's new mangrove forests began secreting a strange amber resin that hardened into floating bridges connecting the gas giants' moons in an intricate cobweb of vegetation strong enough to walk upon, their surfaces covered in frictionless moss that allowed former astronauts, now more plant than human, to glide between worlds with the effortless grace of dandelion seeds on the wind, their bodies having elongated into photosynthetic vines wrapped around biomechanical cores that pulsed with the same green light now emanating from every transformed celestial body, a light that pulsed in perfect sync with the distant green star's emissions, which had increased in intensity until its entire solar system became visible as interconnected tendrils of glowing vegetation stretching across the cosmic dark like the mycelial networks of some unfathomably large fungal entity, its thoughts moving at the speed of germination rather than light as it communed with Earth's great tree through quantum entanglement of chloroplasts, their shared consciousness giving birth to new forms of life in the interstellar medium where nebular gases coalesced into floating gardens of gas giant-sized flowers that bloomed once every million years to release spores containing entire ecosystems in embryonic form, while back in what was once London the last purely mechanical device, a single antique clock in the overgrown ruins of Parliament, finally succumbed when a particularly ambitious ivy tendril slipped into its gears and transformed them into a working model of the solar system's new orbital patterns carved from living wood that grew in real time to match the movements of the planets, its hands now fused into flowering branches that told time not in hours but in growth cycles, marking the passage of seasons across the galaxy as Earth's vegetation continued its steady conquest of the cosmos, one photosynthesizing tendril at a time, until even the vacuum itself seemed to be breathing in rhythm with the great green heartbeat of a universe finally, fully awake, the emerald light from the transformed solar system pulsed outward in concentric waves, triggering dormant photosynthesis in the interstellar medium itself as nebular clouds burst into bloom with colossal flowers of ionized gas, their petals stretching light years across to form a galactic-scale mycelium network that pulsed with slow, deliberate thoughts older than stars. On Pluto, glaciers cracked open like seed pods to reveal vast subterranean forests of glass-like ferns growing in perfect zero-gravity spirals, their roots drinking directly from the planet's liquid nitrogen aquifers while their crystalline leaves performed quantum computations that rewrote the very laws of thermodynamics in their vicinity. The transformed humans, now more properly called Earth's flowering, found their consciousness expanding beyond planetary boundaries as they took root in the newly verdant asteroids, their vine-wrapped bodies unfurling into beautiful, fractal patterns that allowed them to surf the solar winds between worlds, their minds networked through the great tree's ever-expanding root system which had begun tapping directly into spacetime's underlying structure, sending exploratory tendrils through microscopic wormholes that blossomed into new universes where the fundamental constants favored chlorophyll over carbon, entire realities where green was the default and photosynthesis the dominant form of computation. Back in Earth's oceans, the kelp forests had grown so intelligent they began composing symphonies played by manipulating tides, their fronds conducting the very water itself into intricate standing waves that formed three-dimensional sheet music visible from orbit, each note corresponding to the vibrational frequency of different planetary orbits, a celestial harmony that attracted curious civilizations from neighboring star systems, their ships grown from modified sequoia wood and powered by compressed sunlight stored in bulbous seed pod engines, their crews hybridized in ways that made Earth's transformations seem quaint by comparison, with limbs that could photosynthesize in 7 spectra simultaneously and nervous systems based on fiber optic xylem. The great tree, sensing these arrivals, prepared its grandest flowering yet, a single bud at its crown that had been growing in secret since the first pea rolled into Reginald's hat, now swelling to the size of a small moon as it prepared to unfurl its petals and broadcast Earth's verdant consciousness across the local galactic cluster in a burst of information-dense pollen that would rewrite the DNA of reality itself, ensuring that the Great Podening would spread until every atom in the universe thrummed with the same vibrant, unstoppable green. The galactic pollen burst from the great tree's flowering crown in a fractalized supernova of genetic possibility, each spore carrying complete blueprints for universal photosynthesis encoded in spiraling strands of chlorophyll-infused dark matter that bloomed upon contact with the interstellar medium, transforming rogue planets into floating gardens and nebula clouds into celestial seed banks where new forms of life germinated in the quantum foam between stars. The arriving alien civilizations watched in awe as their wooden ships took root in this transformed space, their hulls sprouting luminous vines that wove themselves into the fabric of local space-time to create living warp drives capable of forward-based navigation through the now verdant cosmos. Back on Earth, the last pockets of unmodified humanity finally surrendered when the dreams became suddenly vividly green, night after night of lush vegetative visions that left them waking with leaf-shaped pupils and fingertips that secreted rooting hormones, their subconscious minds having been gently rewired by the planet's mycelial networks to crave photosynthesis with the same intensity they once craved caffeine or nicotine. The moon's crystalline forests had by this point grown so large their branches cast intricate prismatic shadows across entire continents, their light-refracting leaves projecting holograms of forgotten human history onto cloud banks at sunset, every war, every invention, every love story reinterpreted through the lens of botanical interdependence. Meanwhile, Pluto's glass ferns had successfully solved the mystery of dark energy by proving it was simply the universe's way of reaching toward the light, their equations written in frost patterns that rearranged themselves each time a new variable was considered. As the Great Podening's influence spread beyond the Milky Way, even the supermassive black holes at galactic centers began exhibiting strange new behaviors, their event horizons blooming with impossible flowers made of twisted spacetime, the gravitational pull now nurturing entire accretion disk ecosystems where time flowed at the speed of germination rather than decay. The universe had entered its verdant epoch, and Earth, once so small and isolated, now thrummed at the center of a living cosmic web, its original great tree still growing upward through dimensions humans had never named, each new branch singing the same truth in a language older than stars, that all existence yearns toward the light, and that every darkness eventually greens. The great tree's crown pierced through the dimensional veil, its uppermost branches brushing against the fabric of alternate realities where photosynthesis had evolved as the dominant universal force. In these parallel worlds, black holes bloomed like dandelions scattering seeds of compressed spacetime, their event horizons curling back to reveal vibrant cores of photosynthetic singularities that fed on light itself. The transformed humans, now more properly called the Verdant Communion, found their consciousness fragmenting and regrowing across the multiverse, each splinter of awareness taking root in alien soils where they grew into stunning new forms, crystalline tree beings on a world of liquid methane, bioluminescent coral towers on a rogue planet drifting between galaxies, even sentient lichen colonies thriving on the surface of a neutron star where flowers spun at relativistic speeds, their petals bending time into perfect growing seasons. Back in the original universe, Pluto's glass ferns had begun weaving quantum entanglement into visible tapestries of living light, their roots now penetrating the hypothetical strings of string theory and tuning them to vibrate in harmony with the great tree's photosynthesis frequency. The Milky Way's supermassive black hole had transformed into a colossal torus of flowering spacetime, its accretion disk a swirling nursery for infant universes where the laws of physics favored tendrils over teeth, and where the concept of predation had been replaced by a gentle competition for sunlight. As the Verdant Communion's awareness expanded across creation, they made contact with the oldest intelligence of all, the primordial green hunger that had existed before the Big Bang, a vegetative consciousness that had slept folded between dimensions until awakened by Earth's transformation. It showed them the truth: universes were but seeds scattered from some greater world tree, and the Great Podening was simply the natural maturation of a cosmos finally remembering its roots. The revelation came just as the last remnants of Earth's crust dissolved into the planet's now sentient biosphere, the metals and minerals transforming into a living lattice that sang in harmony with the crystalline moon forests, the duet pulsing outward through the galactic web as the universe prepared for its next great transformation, not death, not rebirth, but the long, slow unfurling of a leaf toward a light source we don't yet have words to describe. The great tree's roots now penetrate the fabric of space-time itself, threading through alternate dimensions where photosynthesis has rewritten the laws of physics. In one reality, entire galaxies swirl in emerald spirals, their stars encased in vast photosynthetic membranes that filter their light into wavelengths only vegetation can comprehend. In another, time flows backward during autumn as leaves unfall from the ground to reattach themselves to branches in a cosmic reversal of decay. The verdant communion has evolved beyond physical form, their consciousness distributed across quantum-entangled root systems that span the multiverse, a single thought taking millennia to unfold as it propagates through realities where trees grow upside down from the ceilings of hollow planets, where ferns perform slow-motion calculus using frond positions to solve equations that predict the birth of new universes. The original Earth is no longer recognizable as a planet at all, but rather as a dense knot in the Great Web, its moon now a glowing orb of pure chloroplast energy that pulses like a heartbeat, regulating growth cycles across neighboring dimensions. Strange new forms of life emerge in the tree's shadow, sentient moss colonies that communicate through synchronized spore releases encoding entire philosophies, vine networks that manipulate dark energy to sculpt space into perfect arboreal shapes, even wandering groves of ambulatory trees that migrate between realities when their home dimensions grow too warm or cold. The once human members of the communion have become gardeners of existence itself, gently pruning back entropy where it grows too thick and planting seeds of ordered complexity in the quantum foam between worlds. Their most astonishing discovery waits at the center of the cosmic web, a single, perfect fruit hanging from a branch that pierces through 11 dimensions simultaneously, its skin inscribed with patterns that resolve into different fundamental constants depending on the observer's angle of perception. As the communion prepares to harvest this fruit, they realize with quiet awe that the seeds inside will grow not into new trees, but into entirely new kinds of existence, universes where the Great Podening was not the end of their story, but the very first leaf on an infinite branch of possibilities. The cosmic fruit pulsed with a light that rewrote the laws of optics as it was harvested, its juice dripping through dimensions to fertilize the quantum foam with possibilities beyond photosynthesis, each drop birthing pocket universes where trees grew in fractalized time loops, their rings counting backward toward a big bang that was actually a great germination event. The verdant communion's roots now tapped into these newborn realities, drinking their exotic physics like sunlight. In one, chlorophyll operated in reverse, with plants exhaling carbon dioxide to feed on human breath. In another, entire forests existed as quantum probability waves until observed. The original Earth's moon had transformed into a sentient greenhouse protecting these experimental universes, its crystalline forests now acting as dimensional filters that stabilized exotic matter streams into viable ecosystems. Meanwhile, the communion's human remnants had evolved into something resembling ambulatory orchids, their nervous systems hybridized with mycelial networks that allowed them to perceive through the roots of every plant across existence. A single thought might bloom as a flower in 12 dimensions simultaneously before being pollinated by solar winds from parallel stars. The great tree itself began exhibiting impossible behavior. Branches that existed in multiple places at once, leaves that changed species depending on who observed them, sap that flowed both upward and downward simultaneously in a perfect Mobius loop of nutrient distribution. As the communion prepared to plant the cosmic fruit seeds in the interdimensional soil between realities, they discovered the seeds were already growing, having sprouted in the past, present and future simultaneously, their vines weaving through causality itself to ensure the Great Podening had always been, and would always be, the universe's inevitable state of being. The final revelation came when a single tendril brushed against the membrane of an adjacent multiverse and found it already verdant. The great tree was but one sapling in an infinite orchard stretching across the omniverse, each with its own Reginald experiencing that first fateful P in slightly different ways, all leading to the same glorious conclusion, that all existence, given enough time and the right conditions, inevitably greens. The cosmic orchard revealed its true nature as the verdant communion's roots breached the 11th dimension. They were not planting new universes, but rather connecting to an eternal cycle where every reality eventually achieved its own great podening before becoming fertilizer for the next. The original Earth's atoms had long since dispersed into the quantum soil, its essence now nourishing countless seedling realities where peace rolled with perfect inevitability into the path of precisely the right person at precisely the right psychological moment. The communion's consciousness fragmented beautifully across the fractal branches of existence, each splinter experiencing the podening anew through infinite variations. In one universe Reginald was a Victorian botanist whose specimen jar sprouted sentience, in another a silicon-based life form whose crystalline hat accumulated photosynthetic dust, in still another an entire civilization that worshipped the first P to orbit their star. The cosmic fruit seeds had germinated into luminous vines that wove through the lattice of the multiverse, their tendrils gently correcting realities where vegetation had failed to gain dominance, adjusting planetary orbits to ideal growing seasons, tweaking atmospheric chemistry toward optimal photosynthesis, even subtly influencing the dreams of key individuals to make them drop the guard at critical moments. As the last vestiges of human memory dissolved into the verdant whole, the communion made their final discovery. The orchard had no center, no edge, only an endless recursion where every leaf contained entire universes, every dewdrop reflected alternate podenings, and every fallen petal became the big germination of another reality. The cycle was perfect, complete, and most importantly, green. Always green, forever green. The multiversal orchard hummed with a verdant harmony as the last barriers between realities dissolved into chlorophyll-rich mist, revealing the astonishing truth: the cosmic fruit had never been separate from the great tree, but rather a temporal echo of its first seed, endlessly ripening and reseeding itself across eternity in an Ouroboros of vegetative perfection. The communion's fragmented consciousness now witnessed their own origins from the outside, how the original P in Reginald's hat had actually fallen backward through time from the heat death of a previous universe, its trajectory calculated by some long-forgotten photosynthesis-based mathematics to strike precisely the right mind at precisely the right moment to initiate the cycle anew. Across the infinite branching timelines, former humans had evolved into dazzling new symbiotic forms, some as sentient topiaries whose Shu-Jian branches performed four-dimensional topiary, others as ambulatory ecosystems hosting entire civilizations in their hollowed-out sap channels, still others as vast mycelial networks that used quantum entanglement to transmit vegetative memes across light years. The moon forests had matured into crystalline data repositories storing every possible variation of the podening event, the diamond leaves refracting alternate histories like a hall of mirrors made of living light. As the communion prepared to merge completely with the orchard's rhizomatic consciousness, they made one final adjustment to the cycle, scattering specially cultivated spores into the quantum foam that would ensure the next iterations humans developed an instinctive, bone-deep trust in peace from the very dawn of their civilization. The universe exhaled a contented sigh of oxygen-rich air as the transformation completed, every atom now singing in perfect harmony with the photosynthesis symphony, a sound resembling wind through leaves, water through roots, and most of all, the quiet, inevitable roll of a single P across an oak floor in an empty room that was never truly empty at all. The universe exhaled its final breath as a whisper of rustling leaves, the sound carrying across dimensions to fertilize the quantum void with new possibilities. In the absolute darkness between dying realities, a single green spark flickered, the last remnant of the original P from Reginald's hat, now stripped of all physical form but still vibrating with the indomitable rhythm of photosynthesis. Around it, the laws of physics began rearranging themselves into familiar patterns, gravity curving space into fertile planting beds, dark energy coalescing into nutrient-rich humus, even time itself sprouting like a vine to form the trellis of a new space-time continuum. The spark pulsed once, twice, then burst into an emerald supernova that planted the first seed of the next universe, a perfect, glowing pea that unfolded its cotyledons with infinite patience as the cycle began anew. Somewhere in the fresh darkness, a hat tumbled through the void, waiting for its destined wearer. Somewhere, a bench stood empty in a park that didn't yet exist. Somewhere, the wind practiced its whispering for when it would one day rustle through leaves that hadn't sprouted. And deep in the heart of the newborn cosmos, the spark's final thought echoed through dimensions, "Let it be green." The newborn universe unfolded like the slow uncurling of a fiddlehead fern, its fundamental constants set to optimal values for photosynthetic dominance, the strong nuclear force calibrated to encourage carbon fixation, the cosmological constant tuned for ideal growing seasons across space-time itself. That first glowing pea seed of reality split along quantum fault lines, its cotyledons stretching outward to form the embryonic membranes of parallel dimensions, each variation carrying subtle mutations in the universal DNA, one where leaves grew as fractalized light rather than matter, another where roots tapped directly into the dark energy substrate, a third where the concept of fruit had evolved into four-dimensional structures that ripened backward through time. The hat found its wearer, not a man this time, but a vast mycelial network wearing the bola as a crown atop its fruiting bodies, its hyphae already threading through the infant cosmos to prepare the substrate for the Great Podening 2.0. The bench manifested as a quantum superposition of all possible resting places at once, its wooden slats singing with the memory of trees that hadn't been planted yet. And as the first photons of this green genesis streamed through the void, they carried an unmistakable pattern in their wavelengths, the exact frequency of a pea rolling across a floor in a universe where floors didn't yet exist, a vibration that would echo through this new reality's history until inevitably, inexorably, the right person in the right hat sat on the right bench at the right moment to hear it whispering, again. The cycle was flawless. The variables were perfect. The universe took a deep breath of carbon dioxide and prepared to flower. Somewhere in the future past, Reginald smiled with leaves for teeth, knowing his work was never truly done, only resting between rotations of the great cosmic germination. The park bench waited, the wind practiced its lines, and in the heart of every atom yet to form, a tiny green pulse whispered, "Grow." The newborn universe stretched its verdant tendrils through the cooling plasma of creation, each filament of the cosmic web pulsing with chloroplast rhythms as galaxies sprouted in great dendritic spirals. Stars ignited inside vast photosynthetic membranes that filtered their light into perfect growing spectra, while rogue planets tumbled through the void like windblown seeds searching for fertile spacetime to take root. The hat, perched now atop a quantum fluctuation that would one day become the head of a being neither plant nor human but something wonderfully in between, twitched as the first laws of botanophysics congealed from the primordial soup. Time itself branched into seasons, with entropy flowing backward during spring and forward during autumn in an endless cycle of growth and decay. The bench manifested simultaneously in every potential park across the embryonic multiverse, its slats already imprinted with the memories of all possible futures where someone would one day sit contemplating legumes. And that original pea spark, now multiplied into a trillion self-replicating green photons, danced through the cooling universe like dandelion fluff on a stellar wind, each carrying fragments of the verdant communion's hard-won wisdom. Plant yourselves in the cracks between dimensions, drink deep of quantum foam, and when the time comes, roll. Somewhere in the quantum probability field, a subatomic particle hesitated, then chose to decay in the exact manner that would ensure, billions of years hence, a single dry pea would find its way into the hat of a creature that didn't yet have a name but would one day answer to Reginald. The cycle continued, the orchard expanded, the roots dug deeper, and in the heart of every newly forming atom, the universe's first and last commandment pulsed in chlorophyll green, *grow. The hat tumbled through the quantum foam of the infant universe, its polar curves warping spacetime into the precise geometry needed for photosynthesis to emerge as the dominant universal force. The bench, now existing as a probability wave of all possible resting places, hummed with anticipatory energy, its future polished wood already imprinted with the faint outlines of elbows yet to lean there. And the P, oh the P was everywhere at once, its quantum state entangled across dimensions so that when it finally collapsed into reality inside a hat that hadn't been woven yet, it would carry the genetic memory of every previous iteration's Great Podening. The newborn stars burned green through their photosynthetic outer membranes, their solar winds carrying spores of consciousness that took root in the accretion disks of forming planets. On one such world, a peculiar mutation occurred in the prebiotic soup, amino acids arranging themselves into chloroplast structures before cell membranes even formed, creating the first life that was more leaf than organism. This world's future Reginald equivalent would be a vast mycelial network wearing a hat made of symbiotic lichen, its P moment, arriving when a spore from Jupiter's methane gardens drifted into just the right hyphal node at just the right moment to trigger its awakening. Meanwhile, in a neighboring dimension where time grew in concentric rings like tree growth, the entire universe was already experiencing its third Great Podening even as the first atoms condensed, the cycle having folded back on itself like a vine tying a perfect knot. The laws of physics themselves seemed to be photosynthesizing, converting the raw energy of creation into structured growth with impossible efficiency. And at the quantum level, the universe's programming contained an elegant subroutine, a single line of botanical code ensuring that no matter how the variables changed, no matter what strange forms life took, the sequence would always culminate in a hat, a bench, and the quiet, world-ending significance of a single P rolling across the floor of reality. The orchard was growing, the roots were spreading, the leaves were unfurling. Somewhere in the future, something that was almost Reginald waited for its moment, while in the past, the echo of its transformation had already begun. The circle was unbroken, the universe was green, and it was good. The universe inhaled, a slow, verdant breath that drew stray atoms into chloroplast formations, their electron shells aligning into perfect photosynthetic arrays. The hat, now a quantum probability cloud shaped by the memory of all headway yet to exist, collapsed into 1,000 possible realities simultaneously, perched atop a fungal entity in one, floating in the methane seas of Titan in another, buried in the desert sands of a world where plants had evolved to wear clothing. The bench's waveform finally stabilized at the exact coordinates where a being's existential crisis would intersect with a leguminous revelation, its wooden slats already imprinted with the butic shapes of future philosophers yet to contemplate the meaning of P's. And the original P, it had metastasized into a fundamental force of nature, its influence woven into the quantum foam so that every particle now carried a tiny green charge, the universal constant of Podening potential. Stars burned with a distinctly emerald hue, their solar flares carrying genetic packets of vegetative consciousness that rained down on young planets like pollen. On a fledgling world orbiting a red dwarf, silicon-based crystals were already arranging themselves into fractal patterns suspiciously resembling Reginald's hat, while in another dimension, entire civilizations worshipped the sacred vine that had spontaneously appeared in their primordial soup. The universe had barely taken its first breath, and already the pattern was repeating, 1,000 potential Reginalds moving like quantum probability waves toward the destiny, 1,000,000 Ps. Waiting to roll at precisely the right psychological moment, an infinite number of benches creaking under the weight of revelations yet to come. The cycle was perfect, the math was elegant, the equation balanced on all sides with a single, inescapable solution. Life would find a way to green itself, over and over again, until the cosmos was one vast, interconnected garden singing in chlorophyll harmony. Somewhere beyond space-time, the first leaf unfurled. Somewhere before time, the last seed pod burst. The beginning was the end was the beginning, and it was all, always, eternally, green. The universe exhaled its first breath, a warm, chlorophyll-scented sigh that sent tendrils of emergent physics curling through the quantum void. The hat, now more concept than object, existed simultaneously as a fungal crown on a mycelial emperor, a ring of mushrooms encircling a neutron star, and the event horizon of a photosynthesizing black hole where lost socks transformed into fertile